Welcome everyone to this compilation video of the differences between Shenmue the video games versus Shenmue the animation. Now this is all episodes, so you're going to get all the differences that I discovered from episode 1 through episode 13. You're going to notice that throughout this video I have like different clothes on, or I'm speaking from different areas. But because this is a compilation video, you're going to expect to see that. I have released each of these episodes one by one, but now here's the whole compilation if you just want to sit through and watch a couple hours of Shenmue comparisons with me. Anyway, take care and enjoy. The opening starts with the mirrors, both Dragon and Phoenix coming towards the screen. This take is original, but it's reminiscent of the first Shenmue intro with both mirrors spinning, and Shenmue 2 where the mirrors dance around each other. The show then immediately cuts to the scene in the cave, which was the ending of Shenmue 2 and the beginning of Shenmue 3. So this is the third variation of this scene. The poem is in itself another variation of the poem, which was recited in the same scene in Shenmue 3 and Shenmue 2. Next, in the episode, just like the games, it tells you the date of the first events about to happen. However, the game tells you the exact date, which was November 29th, 1986, while the anime just mentions the month and the year. The anime has an entire set of events before the first events shown in the game. Since I'm sticking to the differences of the game and the show, this must be shown as a big one, even though some of the events like the tournament have been revealed in Shenmue lore. They really do a great job at building Ryo's character early on, which was mostly lacking in the games. I have to pull this scene and mention it. In the games, you never saw Lan Di on his way to the Hazuki residence. It's almost like a deeper look into Lan Di in the first episode, more than we ever got to see in the first two Shenmue games. I mean, wow, we're really getting to see him, but still not really get to see his character. Now this scene that plays out in the anime where Enoki-san and his friend are picking on a little boy and Nozomi comes to defend him is in a totally different time period. These events took place after Ryo's dad's murder in the game, but in the anime it happens before. Also different is that in the game the kid was accused of hitting Enoki-san in the face with a little plane, rather than dropping his ice cream. Speaking of Nozomi, throughout the episode Ryo would refer to Nozomi as Harasaki, her family name, which is common in Japan. In both the English and Japanese dub in the anime, she's referred to as Harasaki. However, in the Shenmue games, only in the Japanese dubbing is she referred to as Harasaki.
Harasaki.
Hazuki-kun.
But both her English subtitles and the English dubbing refer to her as Nozomi. It's important to also point out Nozomi would also call Ryo by his family name, Hazuki-kun, as well in both English and Japanese versions of the show. I prefer how the show handles it, as it's more accurate to the culture. Now these scenes regarding the murder play out mostly accurate to the game, with a few tweaks here and there, but one of the biggest changes to the lore by far takes place when Ryo attacks Lan Di, and Lan Di scars Ryo's face. This is not what happened in the games, but it gives relevance to that scar and much deeper meaning when compared to the games. Now here's exactly another difference from the game when compared to this scene. In the games, Lan Di shows a very distinct tattoo near his wrist while holding the mirror, while in the anime, it doesn't show the tattoo. He may still have it, but so far, we can't see it here. In the anime, it shows Lan Di mentioning that there is one more mirror he wants found immediately. Then we can see Chai, who listened in on the conversation, finding out that there is one more and looking to help. In the game, there is no mention of a second mirror until much later, when Ryo finds out, and after a conversation with Guizang, that's when Chai actually overhears and realizes that there's another mirror. Again, this series is staying ambiguous with the dates. Shenmue Animation shows some days later in this title card, while the game is specific with 4 days later. I guess this might be the anime's way of also being ambiguous with various events that take place and jump around in the story. Plus, the game's dates are really dependent on the player from here on out. In the scenes that play out here, we actually get a glimpse of Ine-san and Fuku-san speaking with police and helping with the investigation. We never see this happening in the games. In the games, the player is able to attempt to call the cops, but then Ryo will insist on avenging his father's murderer without help of the cops, though he does have a similar mindset in the anime. Now here we see Nozomi in class holding the handkerchief that Ryo gave her after he saved her. In the games, we never got a glimpse of his school, which was pretty interesting. Also, this gave more development of Nozomi's character, which was nice to see. We get to see a lot of examples of character development in the first episode, which was never really shown in the games. In this next scene, which was a flashback, we see Ryo getting taught a lesson about strength as he was thrown to the floor. Ryo isn't exactly understanding what his dad is trying to teach him at this point. A similar flashback takes place in the games, however, it's different because his dad is simply teaching Ryo how to do elbow assault, with no deeper meaning to it. Just a move, that's it. Somehow though, the scene still holds a similar weight to its message. In the next few scenes, again, you get more character development which are not in the games altogether, so normally I would have moved on. But this one change was mentioned by many fans as very distinct, so I wanted to mention it here. There it is, Ryo's laughing. In the games, Ryo didn't laugh all the way up to the third game. But you know what? I like that he laughed here. It breaks things up a bit and it does show that he has a soft spot for Nozomi. In this next scene, Tom tells Ryo about the black car that smashed into his truck. In the game, Tom doesn't tell you about the car until Nozomi leads you to him knowing about it. Then Tom tells you that the car almost hit one of his customers, rather than actually hitting his hot dog cart. In this next scene, Ryo and Nozomi are shown eating together in the Ajiichi restaurant, with more character development. Then an old man tells them that the name Lan Di must be connected to the Chinese underworld. That's different from the game because in the game this never happened, but Ryo is pointed towards Chinese by Tom himself. Later that night, Ryo gets attacked by Chai, who is looking for the mirror. This scene also never happened in the games, but perhaps it's replacing their fight in the arcade? Though in the arcade fight, Chai was after information about Zhu Yuanda. After the fight and Chai's escape, Ine-san and Fuku-san run into the dojo and insist that they will call the police. In this scene, Ryo finally makes a decision to find out why his father was murdered and tells Ine-san and Fuku-san. In the game, Ryo tells Fuku-san very early on that he's thinking about going after them. Then much later, after Ryo once again insists that he's going after them, Ine-san overhears the conversation and begs Ryo not to pursue this. After Ryo rejects her, Ine-san then gives Ryo the letter, while in the Hazuki residence, not the dojo. Also important to mention is that the series didn't go out of its way to develop Ine-san too much in the first episode. For example, right in the beginning of the game, after Iwa's death, it shows Ine-san finding a letter, so you knew she had it for a while. Secondly, it also shows her giving him an allowance every day. This just showed how much she cared for him. The episode didn't develop that part of her personality. Maybe we'll see that later. As episode 1 is closing out, we see Lan Di in a residence, without saying anything, which was just so amazing. We rarely get to see Lan Di at all in the games, as his character is a total mystery. As these scenes play out, we hear Shenmue's poem once more, and the episode ends. So the episode started with what seemed to be a retelling of the previous episode where Ryo's dad was murdered, but the scenes were different. That's because Ryo was dreaming of the events, so these were his thoughts. This plays out slightly differently, but it's a retelling of the dream sequence Ryo has early on in the game. Next, we get the intro song and animation for Shenmue. Very much liked and appreciated. Moving on, we have Shenmue walking through Bailu Village, greeting characters that we recognize from Shenmue 3, like Su Shisheng and the fanboy of Shenmue's that we recognize as well. Now, apologies if I butchered the names, but moving on. These scenes never happen in the game, so they're interesting to see. It was also super intriguing to see Grandma Ye practicing and reciting the poem with Shenmue, especially when one of the kids points out, "Who's he?" talking about the man from the east. Now I had to mention this next part. In this scene where Ryo's trying to figure out what the letter from Yanduzu says, he's standing over a capsule toy of Tails, with the case just off to the side. Nice nod to the love of his capsule toys. Pretty cool. This next scene shows Ryo going to familiar places like the Ajiichi restaurant, asking Tao-sun for help with the translation. Ryo then runs into Shenhua in front of the jacket shop where Charlie loved to hang out. However, they never reference that fact in the animation, which is okay, since the story's pacing has to move on quicker than the actual video game. Shenhua also offers to help Ryo find someone who can read the letter, again giving Shenhua more character than in the original games. I love this. Chai is then seen sitting in a warehouse, angry that he was defeated by Ryo. Since these scenes never happen in the game, this stuff is completely original for the series. We never get to see Chai in this form, as he is obsessed with impressing Lan Di. His motivations were never really clarified in the games, but it seems here that he's just a fan who desires to work for Lan Di by impressing him. Moving on, Ryo finds Yamagishi-san in the park, where Yamagishi-san asks Ryo if it's okay to visit once things have settled down so he can burn incense in Iwao's memory. This leads to an interesting arc for the episode, which never happened in the game, starting with Yamagishi-san not approving of Ryo digging up information regarding Iwao's past. Next, I wanted to point out Ryo walking into Bar Yokosuka to speak with Tehuriko Saijo-san. These events are technically in the game when Ryo was looking for sailors, but the animation omits the hunt for sailors concept. In the game, Ryo explicitly asks where sailors like to hang out, but in the animation, he asks where the guys from the harbor like to hang out. I love the fact that the bar is faithfully recreated when compared to the game. Saijo-san tells Ryo in the game that either go to MJQ Jazz Bar or Heartbeats Bar, while in the animation, he just tells him to go to the Heartbeats Bar. Now, I've talked about this scene in a previous trailer comparison, so I'll move on from here, though I will mention that the Heartbeats Bar sign is on the floor as well, just like the games, not just overhead, which I mentioned in the previous trailer comparison. Now, it's impressive that the actual Heartbeats Bar is pretty faithfully recreated. One thing that starts off different is that instead of the bartender sliding a glass of milk over to Ryo, he's just immediately made fun of. Then of course, instead of looking for sailors, Ryo's looking for info regarding local Chinese operation. Once again, just like in the game, Ryo's asking around. The animation, however, changed things up because it shows the tattoo artist just briefly before he picks up the phone to call Charlie. In the game, Ryo simply gets told to come the next day. When Ryo shows up the next day, he gets surprised and attacked by Charlie himself. The setup happened off-screen, while the animation showed Charlie getting a phone call from the tattoo parlor, then talking to his friends suspecting that the Chens are involved. Now here we have a major difference. In the animation, this kid is crying about having his soccer ball taken. Immediately we see that Charlie found Ryo, which is the other way around when compared to the games. At this point in the games, Ryo has already found Charlie and gotten information. Charlie just picked on this little kid near a construction site and just wants to fight as revenge for what happened in the tattoo parlor. Also in the animation, after the scene plays out, we see Chai watching the events happen, which didn't occur in the games. Now this is amazing. We get a shot of Game U, the arcade from outside, and let's just say that it looks a lot bigger in this series. Here we have Ryo showing the Chinese letter to Guangxi. Guangxi delivers food for the Ajiichi restaurant and is Chinese and always wants you to buy him a Jet Cola if you were in the States, or a Coca-Cola if you had the Japanese version of the game. But in the animation, he's apparently drinking a Ripsy Cola. Licensing can be funny sometimes. In this shot, we get a good look at Shenhua's flower shop. Here's where Shenhua brings up entrance exams for school. This conversation does happen in the games, but instead occurs outside of the tattoo parlor where he fought Charlie for the first time. In the game, Nozomi brings up Ryo not being present for the college orientation. In the animation, she brings up that college entrance exams are around the corner, but she assumes that he's already been recruited by a university in Yokohama. She's excited because she's already looking at schools in the same area. In the game, I'll admit, Nozomi seems somewhat of a nag, telling Ryo it's about time he studied for the entrance exams and she's worried about him, while Ryo just brushes her off. The next scene in the animation shows a flashback with Iwao trying to teach Ryo to study martial arts, and not his sports magazine from 1980X. Rio then runs away, insisting that he'd read it later. In the next shot, we finally get a look into Shenhua's room, which we've never seen before. Now see this photo? In the game, it was in a drawer in Rio's room, but here we can see that she had the same photo, but framed. The photo has Nayuki, Ichiro, Rio, and Shenhua in it. This added a bit of depth in the long-standing friendship. She then gets summoned by her grandmother, who says her father's calling from Canada. Now we don't get to see her grandmother in this scene, but this is the first indication that she may not be going to study in Japan, and instead might be off to Canada. Now we cut back to Charlie in the Heartbeats bar talking about the Chens again. He's worried about losing a turf war with the Chens. All of this didn't happen in the game, so this is all new content, and it's just amazing to watch. Charlie comes up with a plot to fight Rio in order to one-up the Chens, since he thinks that Rio is working with them, which of course isn't the case. Next here we have a shot of Yamagishi-san at the Hazuki residence in the altar. After paying respect to Iwao, he asks about Rio, but was told he's away. This is interesting character development for Yamagishi-san, showing what probably should have been his reaction in the games, knowing that Rio is on a revenge quest. He actually made a lot of sense, saying that adults in Rio's life should be pointing him in the right direction. Moving on, we finally start getting shots of inside U Arcade. First we see Excite QTE 2 and QTE Title, two original games from Shenmue. I looked at the score of 87,063 points on QTE Title. I then laughed because I was reminded of the high score that I have in QTE Title, with mine being 1,067,347. Yeah, I'm flaunting that. Then it cuts to a game of Virtual Fighter, which I talked about in my previous trailer breakdown. We then have Rio meeting up with the two guys that he beat up outside of the Heartbeats bar. They walk in and try to apologize, then agree to take Rio to Charlie. This kind of happens in the games, but outside of the arcade, not inside. Rio knew not to trust them, but followed anyway. And then let me pull out this shot that happened right before the guys walked in. We can see the side of a pretty cool Space Harrier photo. I just wanted to point that out. Here we have Rio in the warehouse because he was obviously set up by the two guys. Now this fight kind of took place after the arcade in the game. The guys said they would take Rio to Charlie, but instead he gets set up in the parking lot by all the guys from the Heartbeats bar wanting their revenge. In the animation, it's actually Charlie's crew that jumps Rio, but he makes quick work of all of these guys effortlessly. While this is going on, Yamagishi-san was actually watching, as Rio took care of the situation. Charlie finds out that Rio had no idea who Chen was and just wanted information about his father, thanks to the letter. Yamagishi-san hears this and is shocked. He sees how important it is to Rio to find out more about his dad, since he believes in his father, because he can't believe Iwao might have murdered somebody. Yamagishi-san then has a change of heart. Charlie then tells Rio that Landi is dangerous, and if he pursues Landi, he might get more trouble than what he bargained for. Then finally, we have the scene where Yamagishi-san trains Rio with the move Double Blow. Though this scene played out similarly in the games, it has so much more weight because of the events that occurred in this episode. It really added so much to this one moment that I have to give credit to the writers of the show. He also tells Rio who can possibly read the Chinese letters, helping the plot move forward. In the games, it wasn't Yamagishi-san who told Rio about Shiryu Shao, the teacher who can read kanji. Instead, it was Quan Chi in front of the soft drink machine. One additional thing to note is that in the game, the bench is up against the wall, with the slide being behind Rio, but in the animation, the slide is behind Yamagishi-san. Finally, we close off with Shenhua and the poem again as she overlooks the landscape. Very reminiscent of the games. But then, what the? We see Master Chen and Guisang in what we think is a warehouse number 8 in the shadows. We know what's coming next. And then it's those end credits that we get for the first time in this format in the episode. Now let's start off with Shenhua walking through Bailu village as she's trying to figure out who is the he person in the poem. And she talks to one of her friends as she's walking through Bailu village, and really talking about what could this he person be. Now that is pretty significant in the sense of we never got that type of character development in Shenmue when it comes to actually thinking about the context of the poem and the relevance of the poem. The only thing we saw in the games is, of course, her just saying the poems over and over and over again, but we had no idea who she was. Well, in this, we're actually finding out who she is, so that's pretty interesting. So in this next segment, I thought it was interesting. The events of the game are pretty similar, but when Rio's calling and he has to give the codes to, of course, get to warehouse number 8, like the secret dialogue. Father's Heaven, Mother Earth, like 9 dragons, comrades. Well, instead of saying comrades, like the game says it, in the actual Japanese like subtitles, they used common allies. It's important to note that in the English dubbing, they said comrades. So I thought that was an interesting translation. Technically, it's like means the same thing, comrades and common allies. But I thought it was interesting how they used common allies instead of comrades. Not really significant, but just wanted to mention it. Now here we have Rio tied up, and this was kind of interesting change from the game, because in the game, Rio actually sneaks in and finds warehouse number 8, while in the actual anime, he actually is about to go into that old warehouse section, and then he just gets captured and then pretty much taken into warehouse number 8 because they knew he was coming. So that was an interesting change, and I think actually was a good change. I thought it was better that he got captured and taken in, but of course in the video game, to make it more interesting, have him find a warehouse. Now in this next shot, you can see that Lan Di is interrogating a Chinese restaurant owner to get some more information on the other mirror. Now what's interesting is that they're speaking Chinese, so it's definitely a Chinese restaurant, but what's also interesting about this particular location is that when they're outside, you can see what looks like two guardian lions outside, and then on the inside, it looks like it's a green area, like a forest or nature area on the outside of this restaurant. It reminded me a lot of Niawu, one of the restaurants actually in Niawu. Now it's definitely not the same thing, but it almost had me believing that this restaurant in particular was actually in Niawu, in actual Guilin. It's interesting, even though we have the impression that Lan Di is perhaps still in Japan at this point, but we're not really sure. But this actually leads me to believe that he's probably already in China. Now here, I show a couple of shots of the Chens because I thought it was pretty interesting that the take or what the Chens were doing were actually smuggling Chinese art, and that was given a little bit more context than it was in the actual game. So now I really get that, okay, these guys are dealing with underhanded stuff too. It's not just the Mad Angels, but I guess their way of doing it is slightly different. I thought that was actually pretty cool to elaborate on a little bit. Now in episode 4, we get more character dialogue with Goro. Now in this episode too, we deal a lot with Rio's experience working in the docks and of course finding more information out about the Mad Angels and whatnot. So let's jump right into this episode. In episode 4, an interesting perspective was that Goro tells Rio about kind of like the message board system where if you write down in chalk on the floor like a number, then that lets you know of vacant warehouses where you can possibly do stuff or practice or get away with things. So this actually comes into play later on in the story, which was interesting because I never got that perspective from in the video game. Or it's a nice little thing that they included that would have relevance later on in the story. Moving on, there's additional backstory that was really not explored in the games of Goro, where he's so helpful and he's so willing to just be there for Rio, but we didn't really get an explanation as to why. But in this animation, the explanation is right there about him just admiring Rio because of the fact that Goro's father went out for cigarettes and then never came back, and he never had the guts to go find his father. But yet, after Rio suffered this incredible tragedy, here you have Rio just, I'm gonna find out what happened. So he really admires that. And the fact that they elaborated on Goro a little bit was pretty cool. Now here we have Nozomi, and she waited for Rio all day in his house, and pretty much he didn't show up until like the end of the day because she wanted some advice on whether she should go to Canada or not, because she really had strong feelings for Rio and she just wanted to be able to spend time with him is what I'm assuming, but she never really got to vocalize her feelings, which is similar in the game. Basically in these scenes, she just doesn't ask him for advice at all, which was kind of sad. Now moving on, Nozomi does find out some information regarding the fact that Ryo is after the Mad Angels from, of course, Goro and Mai, and she just wants to get more information about, like, what are the Mad Angels, who are the Mad Angels, and then eventually gets kidnapped. Now this was never explored in the games. Nozomi was just kidnapped. Who knew from where or why or what she was doing in order to get kidnapped? But in the actual animation, you see that she was a little bit more inquisitive, a little bit more curious as to what's going on because she cares about Ryo. And that eventually, of course, gets her kidnapped. Now, in this next picture, you see Ryo jump kicking one of the Mad Angels to go right after Nozomi and get after the Mad Angels because he wants to save her. Now, the games were a little bit different because he just borrows a bike from a friend, but I appreciate this slight change because it makes it, of course, more confrontational because the Mad Angels went right to his house, and also it shows that Ryo was like not kidding around. So it showed him a little bit more tougher than him running around town and trying to find a bike from a friend just to go. That's a little bit too slow, and I think this change was well worth it for the series. Now here we have Nozomi tied up and making the deal with the Mad Angels. Now of course in the game, Ryo makes a deal with the Mad Angels and he says, okay, I'll take out Gui-san, just give me Nozomi back and then bring me to Landi. And then they give Nozomi back. It was like no fight or anything, they're just like, here, you can have her. If you think about it, he could have just taken her and then just kind of not done anything for them in the games, because he could have, who knew if they could really trust Ryo on whether he cared that much about finding Landi or not. But in this story, in the animation, they make a good play, I think, or at least one that makes more sense, where they're like, you take out Gui-san, we'll give you Nozomi back. That makes a ton more sense. So I actually do appreciate this change as well, because as a villain, I think that that's what you would want to do, especially if you have a hostage to your advantage. Now moving on to episode 5. Now this is basically where a lot of tensions is building up. You have Ryo fighting Gui-san, you have Nozomi kidnapped, and someone's gotta save her. So much stuff going on. So let's dive right into it. Now here we have Goro finding Nozomi tied up because he saw the warehouse number written on the floor and he realized something's up, and then when he went to the warehouse he saw that Nozomi was there, and that in itself was pretty cool because it's like, you know, it's a different way of rescuing her, which that's what it was setting up, and I thought that was pretty cool. And what's also interesting that the show did is that you have Mai, you have Mark, you have Goro all teaming up to actually save Nozomi, and that in itself was like, it gave relevance to those side characters where rather than Ryo doing everything. Now this was pretty interesting because this fight did take place in the games, but the one thing that was added and that was really changed from the game was that the final kick where both opponents are knocked down, in this battle, Gui-san basically said to Ryo, let's put on a show. And they both did the swallow dive kick and completely missed each other's faces on purpose so that they can fool the Mad Angels that, you know, oh, they're both taken out. And then they would get up to be able to team up to fight the Mad Angels. Really cool, and actually that made sense too, because again, they knew what was happening. Where in the game, you actually fought Gui-san, and both of you actually knocked each other out pretty bad, but then the events are similar, kind of similar afterwards. Now here we have Nozomi, Goro, Mai, and Mark about to leave the area just to get out of Dodge and get out of danger. And this is pretty interesting because it's kind of like we never really got to saw them in this area because they really weren't here watching all this action take place. But in this show, they made them kind of like relevant and kind of there. And of course, it was important. Now, this shot was actually pretty interesting that the show happened to show off after the Mad Angels were defeated, because it showed kind of like a preview of like, Ryo's still got a lot to do. And it's a silhouette of upcoming enemies that Ryo's going to face in his journey. And it just was an interesting silhouette that you can kind of make out, which to me, it shows like the Yellowhead Gang that Rio will eventually face when he goes to China, which is super interesting. Now here we have pretty much all the friends in front of Rio, and it was pretty interesting because Rio thanks them for their help. But it also showcased why Nozomi didn't say anything to Rio, because she overheard Guisang and Rio talking about the fact that Rio wants to go to Hong Kong to pursue Landi. And in Nozomi's mind, she was like, well, I guess that answers that, because if he's leaving, then I might as well leave too, since we're not going to be together. And that in itself, realizing why she never told Rio what was going on, that was deep. That really got you to feel for Nozomi, especially for the fact that throughout the series, she was so helpful and so involved with Rio's pursuit, and now it's kind of more like he's abandoning her and going on his own. So I thought that was an interesting change. And also, of course, like I mentioned previously, the motorcycle ride took place in the morning, so during the day, rather than the games, which that motorcycle ride was at night. So now moving on, we have the scene where Goro admits to Rio that he proposed to Mai, and of course Rio's reacting like, okay, like this is weird, but fine. And I just wanted to point out that was interesting is that this scene meant something, of course, as in relationship building, but the one other relationship building scene that I was actually looking for and I didn't find is the fact that Rio took a picture with Nozomi in the games, and actually Rio kept the one where both of them were there together, and she kept the one where you can definitely choose which one you keep, but the one that's canon is that Rio keeps the photo with both of them, and Nozomi just keeps the photo of him. But that never happened in the series, that photo together, which I thought was kind of sad and strange. And then finally, you have the final battle with Chai, which basically takes place mostly just like the games, except for that final blow, rather than doing the elbow assault, he does the swallow dive kick. And that in itself to me is like a lot of Rio's training, at least, or Rio's moves in this series, especially the last few episodes, revolved around what Guizan taught him, and not so much the elbow assault. Though there were some flashbacks of the elbow assault, of course, in this series, or at least so far, it really focused on the new moves that he learned, and that's what he used to defeat Chai. So that was different. And now we're finally moving on to episode 6, which means that Rio is in Hong Kong, and Rio's going to have some major experiences. What I love about this episode is that it really dived into a lot of the story that was pretty accurate to the games. I was amazed on how much they were able to squeeze in such a short amount of time. But here are the differences that I found, or at least the significant details that I found that were in episode 6. So looking at this first picture, it's kind of like a retelling of what's happened up to here, all the events in Yokosuka, Japan, before moving on to Hong Kong. What I found interesting is that in the background, that kind of like greenish background to all of these events. First of all, it reminded me of like whenever you put in Shenmue 2 and you would look at a recap of what's happened to the story. This was kind of similar to that. But also, that actual background was one of the backgrounds that was used for the Shenmue 3 Kickstarter as a reward for like a desktop background. And I happen to have it. I'm like, hey, I recognize that. So that's an interesting little Easter egg. I thought this was a major difference that actually was used to save a lot of time and struggles. But it was relevant because, you know, the situation still had to take place. And it actually added to the story. But Rio gets his bag stolen, as what happens in the game. He gets his bag stolen by Wong. Now Wong is this little orphan from the games, which is pretty well known. But the difference is that Wong stole the bag, but it didn't have the Phoenix Mirror, and it didn't have any money in it. In the game, it had the Phoenix Mirror and it had money, so it added urgency. But in this story, it just had some useless clothes and items. Rio kept the mirror and he kept the money, I guess, in his pockets or something, which I thought is pretty interesting because it's kind of like, why take out that sense of urgency when it was actually a pretty significant portion of the game and it mattered at least to get your bag back. But eventually it made sense on why they didn't remove it, because they didn't include any working or story elements where you have to actually earn money in this animation. I guess they just really wanted to progress the story. And the point really wasn't to get the bag. The point really was the I guess, the principle of it. And I think this episode wanted to kind of show that, which was pretty cool. And what was also interesting is that when Joy is actually outside of the hotel and she just drives off, in the game, she was outside of the hotel, but she tells him, tomorrow morning, I'm going to take you to get a job to pay for the hotel. But in this, there was none of that. All right, so a scene that was added in the series was the fact that he was actually reporting his bag was stolen to the cops. We never saw the Hong Kong police at all in the game. And it's interesting that they're actually included in the story because these are common sense things. You get something stolen, you report it to the police. And they're actually showing that, which is pretty cool. Now, another interesting plot detail that they added was that Rio, rather than getting help by Joy right away, saying you can stay here, or the actual boat trip that didn't take place at all, you never saw his events of traveling on the boat and the things that happened there, where actually Chai was on the boat and he defeated Chai again. None of that was included. He was immediately in Hong Kong, so they left it out, unfortunately. And it didn't even show the little girl that he met on the boat, which got Rio to stay at the Free Stay Lounge, which was unfortunate because that would have been at least a place. But they had their reasons for not showing him a hotel. And it showed Rio just kind of looking for hotels because nobody was helping him, which in a sense, that makes sense. People are not going to help you in a strange city, so you're just going to go it on your own. And it just showed him just kind of failing. There was no vacancies. Now, the interesting part is the pacing of the story was so fast. I mean, in just like a 24-minute episode, we've got him already in the Yantin apartments, already meeting the old man practicing Tai Chi. We've got already him in the Manmo Temple. He was at the Manmo Temple within the first 8 minutes of the episode, and that's including the intro credits. All of that so fast. I thought this pacing made sense, especially for the fact that Shenmue 2 is a very big game, and this was hitting all the right spots. The storytelling was really good, and they wasted no time with filler that was unnecessary. It just got you to the point right away. Like for the fact that the old woman in the Yantin apartments tells you right away, Dao Li Shou is in the Manmo Temple. Go there. It wasn't that easy, really, in Shenmue 2 to get that information at first. You really had to kind of find that out well over an hour into the game, but it was just kind of like boom, boom, boom. Dao Li Shou's right here. Go. Or Li Shao Tao. Interesting character development. Moving on. Joy bumps into Wong, and then Wong, of course, tells Joy that he's frustrated because he met this Japanese character and he stole a bag from him that really didn't have anything useful. This was kind of cool because it gave backstory to Wong, and it gave backstory to the fact that Wong was an orphan, never met his parents and all of that, which had kind of figured in Shenmue 2, but this was a nice way of introducing Wong's backstory in the animation. And it made it actually matter a little bit more for you to care about Wong. And not only backstory about caring about Wong, but it actually ties into a bit of Joy's backstory as well, which was something that we really didn't get in the series. Now here, I didn't know why they threw this in, but I thought it kind of mattered. It showed that Shenhua was looking at the Shenmue tree and was like, oh, the Shenmue tree is budding. Felt that was important to point out. What it means? Not sure yet. We all know Shenmue means the Shenmue tree, and it's the Shenmue tree. But it's really hard to figure out what the significance of Shenmue is at this point. And we've been fans of the franchise for over 20 years. Anyway, moving on. So Rio makes a promise to Joy that he will not hurt Wong, that he just wants his bag back. And that promise was significant because Wong has been through so much and she cares about Wong. And she doesn't want this trained martial artist who's a tough guy to hurt Wong. So he kind of makes a promise to her that, okay, I'm not going to hurt Wong. Now, after Rio defeats Wong and Wong's friends like Cool Z, Larry, you have Wong taking him back to Beverly Hills Wharf where he stays and just gives him the bag back. But what's interesting about this episode is that a lot of it had to do with Rio learning a little bit about Tai Chi, but also realizing that he doesn't have to hurt and fight and beat up his opponents. He can use the force of his movements and the force of slowly from gentleness to force, learning what relevance that Tai Chi would have, at least when it comes to his training. And that brings us to the next point, that relevance all mattered when it comes to Rio learning about Gon, which is pretty much practice every day without neglect. And that has to be pointed out, that even in this complex series, they're going to show you the 4 voodoo, which is, of course, is referred to in the games. But rather than, as much as they paced everything quickly, they only have him learning 1 of the 4 voodoo in this episode. Will each of the subsequent episodes teach him another 1 of the voodoo, or are they gonna pack him in? Who knows? But at least 1 episode gave 1 of the 4 voodoo relevance and then moved on from there. And then this is an interesting shot where Rio talks to Joy and basically is like, hey, I kept my promise. I didn't hurt them. And then she has this newfound kind of respect for Rio because he kept his promise and this is a good guy. Next, we have these scenes where Rio goes back to the Manmo temple and is having a conversation with Li Xiaotao after he learns that Li Xiaotao is this woman that he bumped into, Xu Ying. And that in itself was pretty cool because it's similar to the games, of course, their conversation, but also the fact that it played during the credits. So it looks like in this series, they were trying to squeeze in as much story as possible. So rather than just play the credits, they're like, let's show you a little bit more because there's so much to tell, especially in Shenmue 2. And then finally, the episode caps off with seeing a silhouette of Ren, hearing about Rio, and things are going to get interesting, right? And I thought that was kind of cool just to make you anticipate and get excited for the next episode. But like I said, they squeezed in as much as they could, and I thought that was pretty cool. And the fact that they wrapped up this story to have a theme. I mean, the storytelling in these episodes, especially in this episode 6, was so well done that I was sitting there and I'm like, this is written so well, it's so good. And that's what I like about the Shenmue series in whole. So the first thing is that Rio was introduced to Li Xiaotao after just learning 1 of the voodoo. The game's different because Rio had to learn all 4 of the voodoo before he can meet Li Xiaotao. And then basically, right after they meet, they get into a fight in both the game and in the series, just kind of like a sparring match. But in the series, the sparring match happens inside of the Manmo temple, while in the game, it happens outside of the Manmo temple. Next up, Rio meets Fang Mei right outside of the temple right after the sparring match. This didn't happen in the games until after the next morning where Rio woke up in Xu Ying's room. Li Xiaotao is Xu Ying, as you know. Then moving on, Rio is told to go to Guang Martial Arts School right here. This really didn't happen. You had to explore a little bit and ask questions before you found out to go to Guang Martial Arts School in the actual games instead of just being pointed right there. Now this, I think, is basically the animation's way of just cutting through the fat and getting right to what you need to know and where the story wants you to be taken in the series. So that's pretty good. I actually like that. It's like, let's just cut straight to the point. Next scene, Rio goes right to the martial arts school where he meets Zoshan. But Zoshan in the actual animation never tells Rio where this student is. But in the games, Zoshan tells you exactly where you could find Zhang Xuan. He's a performer and he's here, and just go find him. So that's a big difference. So moving on, rather than finding them all yourself, Joy actually wants to hang out. And then she says that she knows of a martial arts street performer in the mall and basically wants to take you there. And then Rio's like, fine, I'll just go myself. So she helps him out and it kind of points him in the right direction rather than Rio not getting that. Now that helps with some development in the story, which is pretty good. They're trying to make these characters involved in Rio's mission, where in the games you were pretty much solo for much of it besides people's help here and there. So Joy is actually brought in and this connects later in the story, so that's pretty cool. Now finally, Rio arrives at the mall where he meets Zhang Xuan, the street performer. The difference in the games and this, which is actually subtle but it's there, is that Zhang Xuan in the animation actually convinces Rio to buy him a beer before anything happens. This didn't happen at all in the games. He just kind of introduces himself and says he's from Japan, and then they get right to the performance, where the animation squeezed in this beer. Now I wanted to know the significance of this beer. Now in this animation, the beer is called San Miguel beer. But the anime changed the beer's name because it's actually very similar to San Miguel Pale Pilsen, a Filipino pale lager produced by San Miguel Brewery. Now what's funny is that the animation and the actual beer do refer to the beer being established in 1890, so there you go. Now the significance of this beer is that it's the largest selling beer in both the Philippines and Hong Kong, so that's why they used it. Now another detail that differs between the games and the animation is that when Ryo mentions that he knows Zhang Xuan's master, in the games Zhang Xuan almost immediately gives you the letter to give to his master, while in the animation, no, we're going to build some tension here, and he just walks away. Now here is totally added original storyline from the animation, which this episode did a lot of. But you see Ren and Joy speaking with each other, and Ren is asking about this Japanese martial artist. And Joy's like, you know what? He's in the mall. Why don't you go check him out? So again, building story and building up to them actually meeting each other. Pretty cool. Now this is also different too, because Ryo, after meeting Zhang Xuan, goes back to the martial arts school and tells Zoshan that he met Zhang Xuan. And Zoshan fills you in on a little bit of the backstory over what happened, which was nice and interesting to hear the story of Zhang Xuan and why he was kind of expelled, which was him just showing martial arts off. Now here in this next scene, we actually have the Yellowhead Gang going after Ryo and then eventually Zhang Xuan, who sees this happening. Now this didn't happen in the games. The Yellowhead Gang was constricted only to the Kowloon portion of the game. So it's interesting that it's actually happening here. Now, quick shot in this next scene, you see Ryo running away with Zhang Xuan as they're escaping the Yellowhead Gang, and then Ren walking towards the mall, and then they just quickly pass by each other, having no idea that they actually just passed each other, which again, building up to them meeting each other, which is pretty interesting. Next scene, we see Shu Ying actually thinking about her brother before Fang Mei interrupts. That's a very interesting part of the story that we really never got resolution on in the games, is what happened between Shu Ying and her brother. Obviously there's backstory to the murder of Shu Ying's father and who did it and how it happened and why Shu Ying's brother wanted to join the Chiyumin. Maybe we might have the potential to see things that we haven't seen about that story, which is still pretty interesting. Now here we cut back to Ryo talking to Zhang Xuan about the Yellowhead Gang. He mentions that the Yellowhead Gang deals with the underworld in Hong Kong. Now that's interesting because we know that they were in Kowloon, but we never got any context that the Yellowhead Gang reached Hong Kong or was that far reaching. Will we see Kowloon in this series? I'm not sure at all, but it's almost like they're going to stay in Hong Kong. It's just different. How can this series actually go to Kowloon and then go to Guilin? A lot of different places in such few episodes left that we have, so who knows? We'll find out in future episodes, I'm sure. Next we have Ryo actually meeting with Joy to grab a bite to eat, which was nice after Ryo was told, hey, you gotta pay rent, this place isn't free. And Ryo hasn't paid anything there because he thought that Joy was hooking it up. So when they go out, Joy actually states one line as they're just having typical conversation on how Ryo is just showing off his martial arts. And she says, a rough cat doesn't show his claws out in the open. This kind of sets off a light bulb in Ryo, and he's like, I got it, now it all makes sense. And then we progress from there. So moving on in this next scene, Ryo goes back to the mall where he finds that Zhang Xuan is getting attacked by the Yellowheads once again, and he's like, wait, stop. Now I get it. You didn't want to show off your moves because you wanted to respect your master's teachings. And that was basically the basis of this episode and the basis of how Zhang Xuan didn't fall from grace. He's still respecting his master's teachings. And at that point, Zhang Xuan finally gives the letter to give to Zoshan, his master, which we saw way back earlier in the game that didn't use all of this character development. So it's interesting that this actual series, even though it rushes a lot of like the unnecessary gameplay elements that we would have played, but really takes us time to expand on emotional development and tying you into everything that's happening that really matters in the series, which I actually really appreciate this perspective. And then moving on, finally we have Zoshan receiving the letter and then of course sharing with Ryo one of the 4 voodoo, which is Ji. So the anime refers to Kai or Ji as keep your heart free of conceit, never use force blindly, or flaunt technique. So now that's 2 voodoo that Ryo knows. So Ryo finally shows up to Manmo Temple to tell Shu Ying that, yes, I know about the second voodoo. And then he explains that he learned about it and that that's probably what Shu Ying thought of him, like he was just flaunting his technique. And she's like, yeah, I thought of that, but there's still so much more. And she also says basically, I'm still not going to help you. I'm not telling you anything. And then Ryo says, well, I'm not giving up either. So we're pretty much at a stalemate. And that's just kind of interesting that it shows Ryo's persistence and it shows Shu Ying's also stubbornness too, to not really share, because she wants Ryo to really get it before she'll help him. And knowing that he was that stubborn and that he really wanted to achieve his goal no matter what, but that stubbornness also reminds Shu Ying of her brother and what happened there. So recalling that, she's like, maybe there was something I could do to like save him, and maybe that's why she was like, okay, let's go. I'll take care of you. You'll have a place to stay with me. So then moving on, they finally go to Shu Ying's room, and this was kind of crazy amount of detail, because I compared the overall look of this room here to the game, and it is surprisingly accurate. They paid attention to a lot of detail, but there is like one little poster here that has a little bit more in the animation than the actual game showed. So kudos to the animators. They're like, hey, let's actually add a little bit more detail, which is not easy to do in animation. But of course, since it's a still shot, that it was probably easier to do. Still, respect to the animators here. And in this scene also, Shu Ying finally shares her name to Ryo. She says, my name is Shu Ying Hong. Where in the game, she actually shared her real name way back in Manmo Temple when they first were about to spar. So that's also a huge difference. But I think stalling on her actual name added more relevance and more connection to them at this point, which is, I think, where Shu Ying and Ryo are actually going to start building a connection. And here's a quick shot of Fang Mei being happy that she cleaned Shu Ying's room before Ryo came, and she knew that she would have to do it for a good reason. She's just so nice. Such a sweet character, and I'm glad that they're showing her to be that personality, which is very similar to the games. Then, of course, next we have just a shot of Shenhua just looking up. These last few episodes have showed just Shenhua just really like thinking and not doing much. Again, similar to the games in many senses, especially to Shenmue 1, where in that game, you really didn't see anything of Shenhua, and it was just like a mysterious girl. In here, now she's still kind of mysterious. She had some dialogue in the first few episodes, but now it's just, she's just quiet, like pondering, like what's going on. So I guess that's what they're trying to establish with that shot. And then finally, one of the interesting things that I wanted to bring up is that they show the credits that still highlight Nozomi. And it was questioned on whether they would actually start showing like characters from Shenmue 2 in the credits and switch it up, which I thought they would have done in the last episode, but the last episode had more dialogue going into that episode. So it was interesting to see here that they actually showed still the same credits. They didn't do like new credits there, which is fine. Now as the episode starts, you see here Shenhua and then Lan Di approaching her while he's holding a mirror. Now this sequence happens when you get the bad ending in Shenmue 2, but in the animation they changed it a bit by it being another dream that Ryo's having. Now Ryo didn't really start having these dreams anymore when he got to Hong Kong. That stuff only happened in the first Shenmue game. But here we're just showing how you can use those scenes to continue to show that Ryo's still having those dreams, which wasn't part of the game, but it's here. Now here in this scene, we're having Ryo basically having to pay his rent by taking the books outside. Now this stuff does happen in the games, but the difference is, in the games, the books were already stacked on a shelf indoors and he had to bring them out. And rather than having that other guy helping Ryo out with the books, you have Fang Mei who's helping out with the books. Basically, they completely got rid of his character and had Fang Mei come out. And also in these first scenes with Fang Mei, you're really starting to see her like slight temper, which is actually true to the games depending on how you treat her. She does have a slight little temper, but in this episode, they really started to bring out her actual temper side. Even though she's pretty sweet, she's got that fire. Now in this next shot, we see Joy talking to the hotel manager, and the hotel manager's like, yeah, he left and he paid his entire bill. So who knows? And Joy was like, what? He left. And what's interesting and kind of reminds me of the game is that when you, of course, transition from the hotel to staying with Shu Ying, what's funny is that you just go from one to the other. You don't like get out of the hotel or anything like that. But in the game, you have the ability to forego paying the rent. If you kind of leave off in a corner and try to sneak out of the hotel, you can go all those days without ever paying that hotel manager anything. But what happens is that Joy actually pays your bill for you. And that comes later on in the game. You get like a note that, yep, she paid the bill, like in your little journal. But in this situation, they're like, no, he definitely paid the whole bill. So, yeah, moving on. So in this next scene, basically Rio took out all the books, and Fang Mei's just really not having it with Rio's attitude. And Fang Mei says, yeah, we're going to have to put them back tonight and then do it again tomorrow. And Rio's kind of like, what? Oh man, and she's just like really cross with him and short with him because she's like, yeah, this is what we gotta do, and she just doesn't like his like attitude. Next scene, we see Han Hui Lu, who is like that trainer that helps Shu Ying in the Manmo Temple, basically telling him that he's really gotta focus on the voodoo to really learn Kung Fu. And Rio's just trying to not be distracted from his mission, which is really to fight Yuan Dozu, and that's what he cares about. Next, we see Rio as he runs into Guishang Li as she's taking old teacups into a tea shop. And she says about the teacups that even though they're old, the value lies in that of the beholder. And that really kind of comes into full circle in this episode because she's really trying to teach him that it may not be valuable to you, but to those that value whatever it is that you're holding, it is very important. And that is what's important in this episode and the full circle. It's almost like, again, when finding out the voodoo in Shenmue 2, it was very quick. It was kind of like one short story pace. But in this anime, they really draw out these stories, which is good because we're seeing a lot more light come into these episodes. And with Guishang Li in particular, she's just trying to show Rio that, hey, you know, you never know what you hold or what value is in front of you until you really take a deeper look. Next up, we have, of course, more scenes that weren't in the game. Joy runs into Wong and basically wants to find out where Rio is. And Wong's like, well, I'll help you if you pay me a little bit. And it's funny because it's really showing you how Joy was able to find Rio so often, and the fact that he really was interested in Rio and looking for him all the time. Where in the games, you would just kind of run into her, or she'd just ride by in her motorcycle and pop out of nowhere. This series is showing you that she was really trying to find out where he was all the time. In this next scene, we see a quick conversation between Fang Mei and Shu Ying. And Fang Mei basically told Shu Ying that Rio's a scatterbrain. And she's like, you know what? You should help Rio. And then from there, Shu Ying was just like, follow me. None of this happened in the games because of course Rio's not here. So if Rio's not there, it didn't really happen in the games. So in this next scene, Wong finds Rio, and then you can honestly see like a little bit of camaraderie and kind of a little bit of a friendship developing between Rio and Wong. And then of course, there was Joy standing right behind Wong. She is kind of wondering, what happened to you? Where did you go? Like, you weren't at the hotel anymore. And he's like, well, I found another place to stay. And there's where you see kind of a hint of jealousy in Joy's eyes. But then Rio, of course, oblivious to everything. It's like, I'm looking for a martial artist. I need a martial artist to know about voodoo. That's where Wong comes up with, there's a lady in Pigeon Park. More on her later. Now here, he goes to Pigeon Park and he actually meets a woman from the games known as Eileen. Now Eileen is basically a martial artist who pretty much trains right there in the park. And when she sees Rio, she's like, I can tell you're a martial artist. Would you like to spar? And he's like, well, you know, I don't have time right now. And she's like, what, because I'm a woman? Both that happens in the game and in the anime. The difference is in the anime, she actually tries to strike Rio, and Rio is able to counter quickly. So she's like, whoa, impressed. And then Rio, of course, asks her, do you know about the voodoo? Because I need to know. And she's like, not really. But then she's like, I know another martial artist. We can go talk to her. And they go to a convenience store where they talk to Izumi. Now, Izumi is also in the games, and she's kind of like a side quest storyline that actually has you fight this martial arts tournament, and she can actually take you there. So the background to Izumi is that she's just a Japanese exchange student, and she's in Hong Kong for that program, of course. She's really good at martial arts because you actually do get to fight her in the games. So Izumi tries to strike Rio, and Rio kind of counters it, and she's like, whoa. But then he's like, do you know the voodoo? And she's like, voodoo? So basically, Rio's out of luck. So now in this scene, which of course, again, is not in the games, Shu Ying and Fang Mei are walking, and they see two kids getting picked on. Looks like a brother and sister. And of course, Shu Ying saves them. She intimidates the thugs so harshly that all she had to do was move her foot slightly and give them a really strong look, and they just hightailed it out of there. But then the little boy, the older brother to the sister, was like, they're just gonna come back and I gotta learn how to fight harder. And Shu Ying was basically reminded of her older brother in the past and pretty much said, look, you gotta find a better path, don't do this. And I think that helps once again establish Shu Ying's reasons for doing what she's doing with Rio and of course with everyone she meets. Rio then finds himself getting tea with Joy and Wong, of course thinking about more martial artists. But then Rio sees that someone's getting picked on outside regarding property. Then Joy kind of fills him in saying, look, this happens all the time, unfortunately, in Hong Kong, because the United Kingdom is pretty much going to let go of Hong Kong, and Hong Kong's going to be on its own. And then land sharks want to take over those properties and knock down those buildings to build new ones, which could be good, but you have old tenants that live there that do not want to move out. And it's happening all the time in Hong Kong, but nobody really pays attention, which is sad. So as he's going through all of this and seeing what's going on, they talk about it's like 4 o'clock, and he's like, 4 o'clock? Oh no, I was supposed to help out with the books at 4 o'clock. And he's out of there. Moving on, Fang Mei is upset because Rio showed up late and she had to do all the work herself. And then she was like, what were you doing? And he's like, well, I had to educate myself on the voodoo. And she's like, you only think about yourself. And he's like, but my ultimate goal and the reason I'm here is to find Yanduzu. And she's like, just upset. And at that point, she's out of there. And then Shu Ying asks Fang Mei, what's wrong? She's like, nothing. Then Rio tells Shu Ying, look, I showed up late and she's upset. And Shu Ying was like, listen, don't think badly of her. She's just reminding me of someone I know. And in this scene, Joy and Wong are sitting in the shop. But I wanted to point this particular scene out. You see the same guy who was dealing with the land sharks, and you see a little girl run up to him with a balloon, and then they walk away together. Now this visual right here that I'm showing you, it kind of reminded me of a very famous artist and his art. It's called Girl with Balloon, and it's from Banksy. Banksy's from London. No one knows who Banksy is, but he does incredible artwork that's random. You never know when it's going to show up, but it's always meant to send a message. Girl with Balloon in particular is one of his most famous murals, and I'm sure you've seen it before. And this mural in itself is supposed to represent basically just kind of like, people sometimes say, you know, it's a formula of like, let it go, let the stress go, but it also has to do with all the things that we deal with in society. And this is kind of what it means to me. And it's just like, let all that stress go and just kind of have the innocence of a child. Now, but it can have many meanings. Banksy's art and Banksy's kind of message also deals with societal big things, like it's anti-war, it's pretty much anti-corruption, it's all of these messages in one, and it's kind of what's happening in this episode, in this neighborhood. So the fact that the animators and the storytellers were able to kind of put that whole message or subliminal message of Banksy in this episode, and it's really not part of the games, but they did it here, I thought was really creative. And it kind of showed that they'll not only take items from the Shenmue games, but different references that other people might recognize. So good on the animators. But anyway, while they're there, they overhear a conversation about a martial artist fighting against these land sharks in Carmine Quarter, in the Yantin apartments. And they're like, whoa, we gotta go there. Now moving on to this next scene, we see that Fang Mei is just headed up to here with Rio. And she's complaining about Rio to Shu Ying. But Shu Ying's like, you know, his style, since he's such a straight shooter, kind of reminds me of you. And this basically gets Fang Mei to start thinking about it, like, wait a second. So in this next scene, Rio is getting scolded by Han Hui Lu about not understanding Kung Fu enough, and that he really is lacking. This reminded Rio of when his father used to tell him that his martial arts is lacking, or that he's lacking. And at that point, you see Joy and Wong show up and be like, "We found another martial artist, Gui Song Lee, in the Yantin apartments in South Carmaine Quarter. We gotta go there." It's like, okay, because he's so focused on his mission. And that whole time while this is going on, Fang Mei was listening and wondering what's happening. So Ryo rushes to help Gui Shang with these land sharks, and he basically doesn't hesitate and beats them all up. And then she was like, "What made you do that for me?" And he's like, "Well, it's kind of like you said before. You just gotta be aware of your surroundings and know what's going on around you, and then do what's right." And throughout all of this, Fang Mei was actually watching. And then that's when Gui Shang reveals that, "Yes, I'm old, but I'm Gui Shang, and you just proved that you can follow this voodoo known as Yi, which is basically to act without hesitation to do what is right. Yi." So there we go, the third voodoo. Moving on. So Ryo rushes back to the Manmo temple at night, and he finds Shu Ying, and he's like, "Is that what you thought I was lacking? Basically, you thought I was lacking Yi, which is to do what is right without hesitation?" And she basically expressed herself saying, you just are after revenge, and really, I want no part in that. Because the events of the day in Shu Ying really affect her. She wants no part of Ryo's revenge, and that's why she's so hesitant to help him. Again, this scene is not in the game, so a lot of these are not in the game, and it really kind of emphasizes that. So here, now we have a big difference between the games and this animation. After Ryo was done talking to Shu Ying, he finds Fang Mei, and Fang Mei apologizes for being so harsh to Ryo. And then she's like, "Look, I want to share some information with you." And then she tells Ryo that, "Look, there's this book written by Yang Duzu that's in the library. You should go find it." And then he just runs straight to the library, and then looking around, he actually finds the book, and that's really where the episode ends. This is quite different from the games, because in the games, Fang Mei does not tell you where the Wulin Shu is at all. In fact, you find out about the Wulin Shu in Wise Men's Kung Fu, where they tell you that there's this book called the Wulin Shu in Manmo Temple, and that's the book that's written by Yang Duzu. And then when you go to Manmo Temple, you can't go at night because it's locked, so it's only accessible when you are doing those chores of taking out the books that you do every day. And then when looking for that book in that room, you find that it's locked. The Wulin Shu is actually locked, and you can't get to it without the key. Shu Ying has the key, and she will not give you that key unless you do this other leaf catching exercise. You have to catch 3 leaves in a row, or else she won't give you the key to teach you another lesson. All of this is not in this series, unfortunately, and I think that's a really good lesson. They might have it later, I'm not sure, but it was really cool to do that, to earn the key to get the Wulin Shu, and it made you try a little bit harder. In that book, if you know anything, a little bit spoiler that might happen in later episodes, it deals with the Chawan sign, and doing the Chawan sign, it shows you that. And you find out more information about the Chawan sign from Gui Shang, but who knows how they're going to deal with that stuff, or if they'll have the leaf catching exercise at all, which I think is a shame if they don't have it, but it's totally okay because this story has enough packed into it. So in this first shot, we see basically Ryo looking at the Wulin Shu book that he found, and of course, he then discovers Chao Sung Ming's name in the book. And basically, this reminds Ryo of course, the moment where Lan Di mentioned that name. From there, you see a little note fall to the floor. Ryo finds it and it's like, oh, what's this? And it was, of course, that Chawan sign note that Ryo didn't know what it was at first, of course, before he discovers what it is later on. The one thing that's different from the games in this scene, because it's mostly the same, Ryo, as looking through the book, he sees that it's like a martial arts book, and it talks about like a northern style type of martial art, which isn't really mentioned in the series, and it wasn't necessary anyway, but it's pretty close to the games. Moving on to this next scene, we see Ryo approaching Shu Ying's room, and he sees Shu Ying looking at a photo of her brother. What's different from this and the actual games is that in the games, she's actually wearing her red dress, which is like kind of like her casual wear, but in this series, she's wearing her blue martial arts dress that she wears when she's in Manmo Temple. So that's kind of different. And then the scene kind of cuts off after you see the tear falling from her face. But in the game, he actually comes in and interrupts her. And then there's more to it that plays out, but we'll get to that later. So now this next scene really changes things up because then Rio walks over to Fang Mei and is like, do you know what this is? She says, I don't know, but you know who might know? The Hong Kong tea shop owner would probably know. And then the owner basically tells him, go visit Guishang. Guishang would know what it is. And that's it. What's different is that in the game, you actually find out what the Chawan sign means by visiting one of the antique shops. And then the antique shop tells you, you can actually go to Guishang and then find out what it is. So it really didn't have anything to do with Fang Mei. You had to do a little bit more investigating as Rio in the game before you actually went to Guishang. Moving on. Now, as in the games, Rio takes the note to Guishang. Guishang explains what it all means, but there is one distinct difference about the Chawan sign, or at least how it's presented. In the animation, Guishang actually moves the cups for Rio and saying, basically, move it in this fashion and then you wait at a tea shop. Whereas in the games, she actually instructs Rio on how to move the teacups, basically for the Chawan sign. So this is very important actually, because in the game, she's basically telling you exactly what to do. So it's like really hard for you to screw it up. But because she did the Chawan sign there, at first you're confused. Okay, what direction is it? Should I put it in the right direction? Is she facing it, or am I supposed to do it a certain way? It adds a little bit of confusion, which I think is an improvement that she showed you because it initially confused Rio, which actually adds more to the story. Moving on. So in this next scene, Rio actually does the Chawan sign and then gets handed a note to basically go directly to Manmo Park. When Rio goes to Manmo Park, he basically gets attacked from behind and is knocked out. Slightly different from the games, but I'll explain. When Rio then wakes up, he's of course like all bandaged up, and then he finds the picture of Ximing, which is Xu Ying's brother. And then he's like, whoa. And then from there, basically later on, you see Fang Mei just helping him recover. And then they have a conversation about, who is Ximing? Can you tell me a little bit more about him? And then she explains to him that he was Xu Ying's brother and that he left. Now, where the games differ, because a lot of these events are kind of screwy and messed up. Now, first of all, let me be very specific. You don't start searching with the Chawan sign until after you know all 4 voodoo. So the fact that he still has 1 voodoo yet to go is one thing. But for purposes of this conversation, let's go to these particular events that the animation referenced. Now, when doing the Chawan sign and you did it at the wrong location, apparently what happens is you get handed the note just like in the animation. However, the note tells you to actually go to the come over guest house and wait for a phone call. So Rio goes, waits for the phone call, and then he gets the phone call that basically says go to Manmo Park. And then from here is a fight sequence. Now, if you win the fight sequence, basically you're okay. But if you lose the fight sequence, which is I think more canon, it then ties into kind of where the animation where he like wakes up and Fang Mei was actually helping him. But at that point, Rio's not asking about Ximing. And why? Because that conversation about Ximing took place after Rio actually interrupted Xu Ying when she was looking at his picture. Rio sees it, that it fell on the floor, picks it up and is like, oh, Ximing? Next morning, he has a conversation with Fang Mei regarding the fact that, okay, that's her brother and he left. And those events happen very differently, obviously. One, in the games, it was early on. In this sequence, it actually happened after these events. But it's still, everything's happening, but it's just kind of all getting crumpled together. Anyway, moving on. Now in this next sequence, we have Rio again trying the Chawan sign. But the one difference is that one person who's watching him trying to do it is Zhang Yu, the barber. Now this reminded me that there's no mention of the 3 blades in the animation at all. And the barber just happened to be at the right place at the right time when Rio's doing this. So Zhang Yu the barber tells Rio, look, you're kind of doing that wrong, but if you want to do it, I've seen someone doing a similar type of Chawan sign at a diner close by. So he basically tells him where to do the Chawan sign. So that's a great hint for Rio. But then Rio realizes, wait a minute, you're a martial artist. Can you teach me about the voodoo? And he's like, okay. So then the barber scene plays out, where you're going to find out the 4th voodoo that you need. In the games, this whole scene plays out very similarly to the animation. However, it's a QTE event. And if you get the QTE event wrong, the whole thing just plays over again and you keep doing it until you figure out what you're supposed to do. However, in the animation, it's like he failed the QTE, but then he's like, basically, get out of here, you're not ready yet. So I thought that was pretty cool that he actually fails, because I think most people fail their first time when they did this particular section in Shenmue 2. So then Ryo just leaves. Moving on. Now, since Ryo knows where to do the Chawan sign, he actually goes to the Dongjing Diner and he actually does the Chawan sign. And then what happens in the animation is that he gets a phone call and he's like, hello, hello? Nobody's there. But then when he sits back down at the table, he finds the note to go to Dongjing Diner at 8 p.m. Now, in the games, what's different is Ryo wasn't distracted by a phone call. He was just tapped on the shoulder and then the note was dropped and then pretty much the guy left, which was really the guy who he had to meet, Yanduzu's assistant. And he just kind of runs out of there. So that in itself was slightly different, unnecessary in my opinion, but it still played out close enough to really match the games. Moving on. This next scene does not play out in the actual games at all whatsoever. Shu Ying's looking for Ryo at Manmo Temple and Fang Mei's like, yeah, he's not here. He actually left to a tea shop this morning. And she's like, he's not ready. He doesn't know what he's doing. Even though it was a short scene, it actually added some context to a later scene in both the animation and in the game, so I thought that was pretty cool. So back at Dongjin Diner, right at 8 p.m., Yanduzu's assistant shows up, and before they can have a conversation, in busts in the Yellowhead gang and captures Zhang, which is Yanduzu's assistant. And then Ryo gets into action. Now this scene pretty much plays out like the games, except there's a little chase and QTE sequence that happens in the video games that is pretty much completely skipped. You see Yuan and the rest of the Yellowhead right outside of the diner versus a little bit further down after somewhat of a cool QTE chase sequence. From here, Shu Ying's actually hiding and Shu Ying finishes them all off without Yuan noticing. What's interesting about this is that now we have some context as to how Shu Ying know to be here, and both the animation and the games pretty much play out similarly from this sequence of events, even showing Yuan falling, which was pretty cool. And then finally, when Zhang is finally talking to Ryo, difference here is that the animation they talk outside, where in the video games they're actually talking back in the diner, which is kind of beat up. But they have a similar conversation as well in both. They're almost completely similar, except one thing. When Zhang is telling Ryo to basically search out Ren of Heavens, the one thing that he leaves out in the animation is why search for Ren of Heavens. When in the game he tells you the fact that Dan Yu, the leader of the Yellowheads, is after Yuan Duzu, and his rival is Ren of Heavens. He doesn't mention any of that in the animation, but he just tells you, find Ren. But why? That's not even told in the animation, which is curious. Alright, now let's talk about Yuan. Yuan is a character that has some, I guess, controversy. So Yuan is actually a trans character in the animation. You can tell by the way he's dressed and how he's referred to in the male voice that it's a trans character. However, that actually matches the Japanese intentions and how the Japanese game was made. It was a male voice actor that played that character, and everyone refers to Yuan as he. But when it was getting translated for European audiences and then in North America for the Xbox release, they re-recorded the voice to be female and referred to Yuan mostly as a female in the Japanese subtitles and in the North American release of Shenmue 2. And Yu Suzuki did this because he was afraid on how that type of character would be accepted overseas when compared to Japan. Thankfully, in the animation, they stuck true to the original intentions of Yu Suzuki and the original Japanese release, which I'm pretty happy about. So now this next sequence of events is like, again, totally different from the games. So let's go over the animation steps first. So in the animation, Ryo goes straight to close to Beverly Hills Wharf, meets with some of Ren's gang, is pretty much take me to Ren, and they just trick him and assault him from behind. When Ryo wakes up after the assault, he's with Wong, and Wong was like, look, I know where Ren is, I really can't help you too much to get to him, but I'll give you a lighter. Take this lighter and you'll be able to actually access where Ren is, but you gotta tell like the group, look, I'm here to pay off Ren because Ren loves money. So Ryo's like, okay, thanks for your help. And then when he approaches again and they're like ready to beat him up again, he's like, look, I have this lighter, I'm here to give Ren money. they immediately take him to Ren. Then when Ren actually meets Ryo, he's like, okay, where's the money? He's like, I don't have money. I want to know where Yanduzu is. Ren's like, okay, let's see what you got, kid. And Ren actually swings a knife right at Ryo's neck. Ryo just doesn't move. And he's like, you didn't move. Why? And he's like, all right, come with me. I'll take you to Yanduzu. Now, this is way different from the games because the games actually stretch out your ability to meet Ren. First of all, Ryo's got to find out where the heck Ren of Heavens is, and he finds out that they're in Beverly Hills Wharf. Now, to get into Beverly Hills Wharf, it's similar in the fact that you have to get the lighter, and Wong actually gives you the lighter in the games too after you get beaten up, so that part matched. But then when you get into Beverly Hills Wharf, you still have to find Ren. So you actually are looking around for him, practically getting beaten up everywhere you go in Beverly Hills Wharf until you actually meet Sam, Larry, and Cool Z, who said they'll take you to Ren, but you're gonna have to get like a lot of money. So after you raise this money by like gambling, by doing local street fights and everything, and it takes a long time, Sam, Larry, and Cool Z take you to Ren. Now the base where Ren is, where you finally talk to him, looks kind of different from the animation. The animation's base of where Ren is actually looks like his base from Kowloon, but that's not till much later in the game. But in the video games, it looks totally different where you meet Ren. And then of course, Ren is like, takes the money from you. He's like, thanks. And then he attacks you with the knife, but you have to do a QTE sequence rather than just not move. So the reason that they did this in the animation is to play off later, of course, in the story and kind of tie things up, which I think they did a really good job. This is how you meet Ren, and it's different in the games when compared to the animation. Again, they just rushed it, but they got rid of a lot of fat that was unnecessary because it's a video game. Video game needs to stretch out the time. Moving on. So this scene is very similar in both the games and the animation. Ren and Ryo are seeing Yuan making a deal, of course, with that guy who would race the ducks. It's the same guy. And then basically Ren tricks everyone, turns off the lights, and steals the money. When the lights are on and they're like, where'd everyone go? Ryo realizes that Ren disappeared. Ryo screws up, knocks over a pole. They find him. Ryo just beats them all up. Same thing happens in the animation and in the games. But here's where it's different. When Ryo leaves, in the games, Ryo bumps into Wong and Joy, and they tell him he's at Pigeon Park. Now, he's in Pigeon Park in both the animation and the games. But in the games, he's hanging out with Cool Z, Sam, and Larry. That's different because for some reason, Cool Z, Sam, and Larry are completely missing from these events in the animation. You just see Ren there by himself, kind of like holding the bag, where in the games, he's not holding the bag. And then the chase sequence happens. In the games, you're not fast enough to catch Ren, but you are fast enough to catch one of the other guys. And then, of course, be taken to Ren. In the animation, they skip all of that and you just chase Ren, eventually getting to Lucky Plaza. And at Lucky Plaza, that's where the sequence of events happens, where you chase him up the building and then fall onto a truck, in both the games and the animation. And then Ren, of course, sees the mirror and then knows that there's something up going on, even though Ryo grabs the mirror right away. And he's like, you know what? I'm gonna help you out because I care about money and I want a piece. This looks like it's got a lot of money tied to it. That was pretty similar, but the difference is that in the animation, the one key detail is that Ren mentions that, you know what? I'm usually on the defensive, but you were like pretty cold, like you didn't even budge when he put the knife at him. And then that's when Ryo figures out, wait a minute, that's the lesson I was supposed to learn for the voodoo. And he's out of there. The other difference from this and the video games is that right from here, Ren is like, Danyu's in Kowloon. We gotta go to Kowloon. So he's like, okay. And that's kind of like the end of this disc before you're moving on to the next disc. Or if you're not playing on the original Dreamcast, it's just really like the next chapter. That is very significant, where they still had a little bit more story to tell in this area, of course, because Ryo still needed to learn the fourth voodoo. So in this next scene, Ryo passes the test. He went back, passed the QTE basically, and he learns the fourth voodoo, Tan. And what it means is, never be shaken, remain calm and resolute to make the proper decision. What's nice is that the animation gave a character arc to Zhang Yu. Even though it's very limited, it gave him a little bit more to do. In the games, it was just like, you meet the right guy and he just teaches you voodoo without you really having to do much except pass this one minor test. It allowed Ryo to learn what he had to do and mix it in with progressing the story. So it was like several things were going on at once, and I loved the way the animation was able to bring all of the voodoo together, add to the story, but yet progress it with meaning. It just comes together a lot better than the actual video games, which is, it's rare to say that an actual medium that's just watching entertainment outperforms some story elements when compared to the games, but you have Yu Suzuki's involvement in this, which is so important, and I like what the animators did here. So then from here, this scene is completely original to the series, but it kind of wraps up this story arc in a sense. Ryo goes back to Manmo Temple where Shu Ying is standing there, and he basically says, I know about your brother, and I know that Seeming left. I know all about that. That's why you've been treating me the way you have. And then she asked him, why did you come here? And he said, well, it was to learn about my father's murder. And she's like, well then, what happens when you do learn about it? What if you find out that it was just a mistake? Then what? And he's like, I don't know. But then she says, I know what you'd do. But then he's like, look, we're not on the same page. And she's like, you know what? The purpose of martial arts is to preserve life, not destroy it. And at that point, Ryo was like, thank you, but I have to leave. And that right there adds some heartbreak, because that scene really didn't play out at all in the games the way it did. But now it added an extra layer to Ryo leaving and her feeling abandoned again, just like her brother abandoned her. And she has a flashback of him leaving, and she's just hurt. Basically, after he leaves, she just looks down and she's like sad. Fades to black, and then she says, as you wish. So starting off with this first scene, we see SHENMUE talking to her father, and basically her father's saying, I've got to go to the stone quarry, and she's like, can I make you food? And he's pretty much like, I'm gonna be gone for a couple of days. So she's pretty much like, I'll bring you food when it's ready, and then he just leaves and she sees him walking away. And then of course she's looking at the SHENMUE tree and is like, oh, it's starting to bloom. Now none of this is in the games, but it gives context to SHENMUE's character, and then of course it seems that her father knows a little bit more than he's letting on about possibly the prophecy or what's going to happen. So he's really adamant about doing what he needs to do. Moving on. Now the next scene, you see Ryo actually walking away from Manmo Temple, and he bumps into Wong, and then Wong tells him Ren's waiting. And then when he goes to Ren, in of course the hideout, Ren's kind of like intrigued by all of this that's going on. And he mentions to Ryo that, hey, I know this guy named Yang who might know where Yandazu is, so let's go talk to him. And then they just head off to Kowloon. In the games, what's slightly different about this is that when Ryo was leaving Wanzai, and basically that area, to go to Kowloon, he said goodbye to everyone first, and then before leaving the Manmo Temple, you see Zhu Ying teaches him the counter elbow assault. And this didn't happen in the anime at this point. Now we know that it'll eventually happen, but it didn't happen at this point in the animation. But it did happen in the games before he left. And leaving this area was like a big, grandiose event, because you had to say goodbye to everybody. You were leaving this area, and then you were traveling to Kowloon, which seemed like it probably was very, very far away. And you see Ryo on a bus actually going to the walled city of Kowloon. But if you know anything about the distance between Hong Kong and Kowloon, Kowloon is technically in Hong Kong, and it's only basically around 4 kilometers away from the main area of Hong Kong, so it's not that far. So the actual animation made it seem like, okay, it's a lot closer, it's just in a different area, and then let's go there. So in this next scene, we see Ryo and Ren meet with Yang at his shop in Kowloon. In this scene in the animation, Ryo shows him the letter from Yandazu, but then Yang tells them, go to this man dressed in black at a location that he gives them. And they just go on from there. Now in the video games, the difference is that Ryo doesn't show him a letter, but he actually shows him the Chawan sign little card. And then that's what convinces Yang to help them out, because the card had Yandazu's symbol on it. So then he tells them not only to go to a man in black, but tells them specific instructions about where to go. And they proceed from there. Now in this next scene, we see Ryo and Ren go to the man dressed in black, and he tells them to go to the door. Now Ren is initially untrusting because he's seeing these characters are looking suspicious. So he tells Ryo, go in that door by yourself, I'm gonna wait out here. And when Ryo goes to the door, he's presented with Dan Yu. And Dan Yu is like, huh, gotcha. Now, these events are very similar to the game, but the game actually draws it out a little bit more with various men in black before you go through the door. Ren eventually comes in to save the day, or try to save the day, just like in the game. So both the animation and the game actually are pretty similar, with a few dialogue changes, but for the most part it's similar. And then of course at the end, Dan Yu finishes off both Ryo and Ren and locks them up. Now in this next scene, we see that Ryo and Ren are locked up, just like in the video games. However, the animation added something that wasn't in the games, and it was context on how Dan Yu came to power. See, Dan Yu and his Yellowhead gang were actually part of a security guard for a large group that owned casinos called the White Tie. And the White Tie were pretty much in control of Hong Kong. But then, Dan Yu and the rest of the Yellowhead betrayed the leader of the White Tie and actually blew up his car. And that actually led to the Yellowhead gang, led by Dan Yu, to take control of Hong Kong for the most part, or at least take control of the underworld settings of Hong Kong. He still wasn't in fully control, because in control is, of course, the Chiyu men. But it gave them more power, and that's kind of what led to Dan Yu's uprising. Now in the games, none of that backstory is ever explained, so it's all new to fans. And then the events of Ryo and Ren breaking out are very similar in both the games and the animation. Now in this next scene, you see Ryo and Ren talking on the rooftop. Now Ryo's basically explaining who he's really after, and he explains to Ren that he's actually after Lan Di of the Chiyu men. Now this kind of intrigues Ren, and then he can't believe, you're after the Chiyu men, holy cow. And then we skip to a scene where it actually goes to Lan Di talking to Dan Yu and Yuan. And Dan Yu and Yuan, they're bent at the knee over Lan Di. So right here we can tell that Lan Di is a very powerful leader. And Dan Yu is basically saying, look, we've captured these two. One of them is Japanese, one isn't, and we think that we're actually going to get our hands on Yanduzu, and it's just there. And then basically they're like, if we get Yanduzu, can we actually get control of Hong Kong? And Lan Di's kind of fine. He doesn't really care, but Lan Di is intrigued at the fact that he mentioned a Japanese kid, and he's like, wait a minute, Japanese? Almost like he knows this Japanese kid, and he kind of knows what's going on. Again, Lan Di doesn't care about what they do, and then in comes the guy from the Yellowhead gang, basically telling them that, look, these two guys escaped, and that's where the scene ends here. Now moving on to the escape scenes, of course, we see Ryo and Ren trying to get out. They go into an elevator, and then they bump into Yuan. They have a little scuffle with Yuan, and then basically knock him down. And then that's when Dan Yu comes out of the elevator. He's like, what happened here? And from there, he starts chasing Ryo and Ren up to what looks like an exit, but that exit actually isn't really an exit, and they have to jump over to the next building one level down. This is pretty similar to the game, slight but unimportant differences. But the one thing that is different from when I play it, I'm not sure if it's even possible in the games, but in the games, it's like daytime when they actually escape. But in the animation, it's nighttime when they jump from building to building. So just thought I'd mention that. Moving on. Now this next scene is kind of different in the games when compared to the animation. Now in the animation, Wong is taking the cuffs off where Wong's base is, in Wanzai. And you have Joy there, and you have Wong there, and then of course, Ryo and Ren. And then basically they leave to go settle the score with Yang. Now the difference is, rather than taking place in Wanzai, it takes place in Ren's hideout in Kowloon, and he just sits there and orders Cool Z to get Wong for me, because Wong is pretty good at loosening handcuffs. So when Wong shows up, he makes Ren promise to him that he'll take Ryo back to Wanzai because he misses Ryo. So Ren agrees, but then of course after they're off, he's like, no, we got business to take care of. And then they go handle their business with Yang. Now in the animation too, you had Joy in the room the entire time, but in the actual video game, Joy was never inside of the hideout with them. You don't see Joy until after they leave the hideout and they're about to go, and Ren realizes, wait, you guys know each other? And he's like, I don't care, we need to go handle our business with Yang. Moving on. So now this next scene is very similar in both the animation and the games. They beat up Yang and press him for information, and that's where Yang reveals, you know what, go see Wong, he'll be able to help you. And then Ren immediately knows, oh, Wong, that's the wiretapper guy. And Ryo's like, you know him? He's like, yeah. Now in the games, Ren is pretty much like, okay, here's where you go, but you go, I've got some business to handle. And Ryo's like, okay, I guess I'll go on my own. Whereas in the animation, Ren goes with Ryo to the wiretapping place. Now this tends to happen a couple of times, where in the animation, Ren and Ryo are together, whereas in the games, Ren tends to be busy and Ryo's got to do it himself. Now in this next scene, you see Ryo and Ren looking for the tapes, and of course, in the actual video game, Ryo's looking for the tapes alone. But the animation, pretty much they find the tapes right away. And then they go to the hideout and Ren gives him a tape player and says go through all the tapes. Now in both the animation and the video games, it's kind of similar at this point where Ren is like, here, you listen to the tapes, and Ryo knows what he has to do. Ren's still feeling, and you can see it in his face, he's still getting that big score vibes, like this is gonna lead to something. Now in this next scene, we go back to Manmo Temple where we see Shu Ying, and she then starts having more memories of her brother wanting to leave and then go and join the Chiyu Men so that he can avenge their father's death. Though this scene is kind of original, the flashback is actually in the games as well. But the way it plays out in the animation is like it's at a unique point. Because in the games, when Ryo's going over the tapes, it just skips to the next morning where Ryo's still listening to all the tapes. And it doesn't have this breaking point. So that's that. Moving on. So now in this next scene, they find the tape where they actually hear Yuan's voice talking about how they captured Jian Duzu's assistant. Now this is alarming, and of course they want to find out where Yuan is. Now in the animation, immediately you see Ren say, you know what? I heard a squawking bird. We've got to go to a bird shop and then ask around, because then we might be able to actually find out where Yuan hangs out. Now this is different from the video games, because in the video games, you don't immediately realize that that's a talking bird until you go to a daycare and speak to a little kid where they mention, oh, you know what? He always has something, an animal that talks a lot. And then of course, speaking to the teacher, you realize maybe you should go to a bird shop because it was a talking bird. So it's kind of more drawn out in the video games. Whereas the animation was like, Ren figured it out, let's go to that bird shop right away. So I think it makes a lot more sense to shorten this up rather than pull it out and make it longer. But the game, of course, wanted to stretch out the storyline as much as it could. Moving on. So now in this next set of scenes, it's kind of similar to the game where they show up at the bird shop, and then of course, yeah, Yuan likes to pass by, so they hide out waiting for Yuan. While they're waiting around, Ryo was like, why are you helping me so much? And Ren was like, well, because I see that there's a big score here. Ren is making excuses as to why he's helping Ryo out, but it almost seems like we're trying to build to what Ren's intentions actually are. And I think that that's very similar to the games, though the games haven't really revealed that as much yet. The series has really tried to pull that out from Ren's personality. Now, eventually, Yuan does show up, and then just like the games, they're like, we're gonna follow. However, the difference is the games have you follow Yuan on a bunch of weird places and different things and different interests and how Yuan actually is. So you're able to see a little bit more of Yuan's distinctive personality in the video games. Whereas here, Yuan just got the bird feed, heading straight back directly. But they did pull out the fact that Yuan saw trash and Yuan was completely disgusted by it. Now that's a normal person's reaction, but Yuan's reactions was in particular emphasized, and Ren was like, geez, must be some sort of neat freak. And of course, hatred for trash will come into play later, I would assume. Moving on. Now in this next scene, this is of course Ryo and Ren breaking into Yuan's apartment. In the animation, they just knock on the door, Yuan opens it, and then Ryo punches him in the gut, knocking out Yuan. From there, they find Yandezu's assistant, and then of course Danyu approaches. Now these first few scenes play out kind of different in the games. The game adds one little detail which is omitted from the animation. They're both arguing over who's going to attempt to get in first. And then Ren says, you know what, we'll flip for it. Heads or tails. And then of course, no matter what you pick as a character, Ryo will lose the coin toss. From there, Ryo knocks on the door, and then when Yuan opens it, Ryo smash kicks the door open. Yuan reels back and gets knocked out. Now that difference, I guess, was subtle, but it's like the animation removed that heads or tails game, which kind of a shame because I thought it was pretty funny from the games that they didn't put it in the animation. But then of course, the rest of the events where Danyu is approaching the apartment, and of course they hide, and then eventually they bust out of there and trick Danyu into going into the closet. All of that was similar in both the games and the animation. Now this next scene where they actually have Yandezu's assistant and they saved him. Kind of different between the animation and the games. Now in the animation, you take him outside, and then of course he reveals that Yanduzu's in the Ghost Hall building. And then from there, he gives you a set of keys, and he's like, here, you'll need this. And then finally, Ren mentions, you know what, we'll have Sam take you back to the hideout. Now that's the first time that the other gang members are mentioned in a while in the animation. But the difference is that in the actual video games, you take him to Ren's hideout, and then Ren's hideout, you see Joy comforting him, and you already see Cool Z in the room as well. And then Yanduzu's assistant reveals Yanduzu is in the Ghost Hall building, but rather than giving you 4 keys, he gives you 1. Now in the animation, Ren and Ryo go together, but in the video game, Ren is once again saying, I'm kinda busy, you know what, Ryo, you go on ahead, I'll meet up with you later. These scenes play out a little bit differently, but for the context, still the same thing. Basically, let's go to Yanduzu. Now these scenes in particular are very different from the games. In the animation, we see Ren and Ryo just go to the Ghost Hall building, use the keys in different weird places as they're going from trapdoor to trapdoor to trapdoor, before eventually getting to Yanduzu. In the games, you actually have to climb the Ghost Hall building by yourself, going through stairs, elevators, and then of course, walking across planks, which was all very dangerous. But then you eventually get into a room where you have to use that first key and other keys on a specific statue where you can put 4 keys into that one statue before the door opens. In the animation, even the last statue that's used is very different from the statue that represents the door to open Yanduzu in the video game. So that at least is different. But then when you finally meet Yanduzu, he's pretty much sitting there with a book, which is very strange, but he was just sitting there like, who are you guys? So only that part is similar, everything else is different. But then of course we see Danyu and Yuan and everybody just come in, and Danyu actually knocks Ryo out the window where Ren just kind of jumped out to get the heck out of there. That part is very similar in both the games and the animation. And then finally we have Danyu and the thugs jump down, and they're all ready to fight Ryo, who was basically dazed, and they're gonna really kick his butt. And at that point we see Shu Ying just come, and she just looks at Danyu like, oh, it's on. And Ryo's like, well, what the heck's going on? The games is slightly different because when Ryo's knocked down, he's still on his feet. We see Danyu there, but then gang members start to fight you first before Danyu jumps down ready to take you out. And then the game kind of like fades to dark before we see that Shu Ying comes in, and we only see her legs before she comes in and kind of saves the day. And that's it, before the game moves on. Okay, so in this first scene, what you see here is Shu Ying about to face off against Danyu and basically the Yellowhead gang. Now it's different from the games because in the games, you never see what's going to happen between Shu Ying and Danyu. In the games, you assume that she just takes care of Danyu and then of course takes you back to the church. But in the animation, it shows that Danyu did not fight Shu Ying, and Shu Ying just pretty much wasted all the other guys. Pretty cool. Moving on. So in this next scene, we see that Shu Ying saved Ryo and brought her back to the convent where she was raised. Now, a couple of differences in this scene when compared to the video games. First, Shu Ying is wearing a blue dress rather than her casual red dress, which was in the games. Second of all, you see Ryo recognize flashbacks where Ryo was saved, but he didn't know who did it, and now he's realizing it was Shu Ying that saved him. And then finally, in this scene, Shu Ying teaches Ryo the counter elbow assault, kind of in the outside of the building or outside of the convent, rather than the earlier scene, which was where she actually showed him the counter elbow assault, and that happened back in Hong Kong. He already knew counter elbow assault by the time he got to Kowloon, so that's a slight difference, but moving on. Now in this next scene, we see that the Yellowhead are celebrating with Danyu the fact that they actually captured Yanduzu. But then Danyu's like, who was that woman? And do we know anything about her? And then Yuan speculates, could it be Chun's daughter? Now, I looked up that character to see if there was any significance or any history on who Chun was in connection to Shu Ying, because I was like, wait a minute, I've never heard of this. Are we going to get some more backstory, more than what we've seen in the games with Shu Ying? It gets brushed off, and then Danyu orders for Yuan to deal with Ren and Ryo, because obviously he wants to make sure that he ensures Hong Kong for himself, which means delivering Yanduzu to Landi. Moving on. So now this next scene takes place back in Ren's hideout. Now in the animation, they tell Yandezu's assistant that Yandezu's been captured. And then Joy and Wang mention that he's been taken to the Yellowhead building and that they know where he is. Slightly different from the games because in the games, yeah, they're in Ren's hideout, but Joy comes in by herself while Wang and Ren are already there, along with Yandezu's assistant. And then Joy's like, I know where he's been taken, the Yellowhead building. So slightly different from there. Now they want to actually get into the Yellowhead building and figure out how to get in there. Now Yandezu's assistant immediately says, I know someone who might know. He actually lives next to the Yellowhead building. You guys should go there. Where in the game, it's slightly different because in the game, he's like, you know what? I'm going to go out and investigate. To get in contact with me, use the Chawan sign. And then Rio actually goes around the building of the Yellowheads to see if there's any door or way to get in, and he never could get in. Then Ren was like, why don't you try using the Chawan sign and see if you can figure anything out. And then eventually Rio does use the Chawan sign. After using the Chawan sign, he gets a note that says, go to room 503. Rio goes by himself to 503. That's the slight difference, but a lot of fluff to basically take you to the same area in the game where the animation just cuts straight to the point. Moving on. So now this next scene, when they're entering room 503, is in both the animation and the games. However, in the games, you are entering by yourself, whereas in the animation, both you and Ren are going in there. And the only reason you're going by yourself is because Rio kind of went out on his own to find out where this room is, whereas Ren just came with Rio from the hideout straight to this room. Now here's where you have that fight in the dark with the quote-unquote blind guy. Now, the animation never hints to the fact that this guy is blind or faking that he's blind. When in the games, this guy acted blind early on before, eventually, even in the games, is like, yeah, I'm not blind. But he unveils that he knew Iwao. He basically knew Rio's father. And Rio tells him that he's dead and that he passed away and that they need a way to get into the Yellowhead building. At that point in the animation, basically, he's going to tell Rio and Ren how to get in there because, of course, of the tragic events. And then they just leave, but you never really see what he tells them or how to get into the buildings. That's just implied that he just tells them. Where in the games, he actually tells them, you're going to have to meet and impress the scout, and then that's how you'll get in. But the animation had its purpose for skipping it a little bit. Moving on. So in this next scene, which is really not in the games because Ren didn't go with Rio to see this guy, Rio says, you know what, Ren, I'm going to do this on my own. The Yellowheads would recognize you. And he's like, what the hell? You bought them too. They'd recognize you as well. He's like, I've got this. So Ren's a little bit upset that he's just kind of like, what? Now you're leaving me out of it? Which I think adds to the story a little bit. And then, of course, Rio's like, tell Joy and Wang, thanks, but I'm going. I think that adds some character and motivation to Ren because he wanted to be a part of it. Now he's getting cut out. Next scene is actually one I particularly enjoy. For me personally, Rio is going to, of course, have those street fights that he's supposed to have to get recognized by the scout. And then Rio goes to fight En Jung-zu. I think that's how you say his name. Now this in particular, I enjoyed because he was one of those fights that I just fought over and over again to get a lot of money. Now he fights in the acrobat style, and the point in the video games was just to, if you can grab him once and throw him, you win. But in the animation, it was just if you can knock him down. And Rio, when he goes up, he pretty much knocks this guy down really quickly, almost too easy. Now, he doesn't throw him, he just hits him. And to me, this almost reminded me of Shenmue 3, because I'm like, Shenmue 3 does that. Shenmue 3 are no throw moves. Are they doing that in the animation as well? But then the animation also then adds something special, because the animation then goes back to that conversation that you had. So now the audience is getting explained why he's doing what he's doing in these street fights, which is basically he's doing it so that he can get the scout's attention. I like how they just played with that scene and just pulled it out to have more meaning so that it could answer your question, but made it a little bit more interesting. I like that slight change. Moving on. Next scene, which is completely unique to the animation, you see Joy talking to Ren, and Ren's just kind of like upset that, you know, Rio told him to stay away. And then Joy's like, makes you wonder why you can't just be more like him. And he's like, ugh. She says, basically, I'm going back to Hong Kong. I don't want anything to do with all of this. What are we supposed to do? And I think this gives context to later events that we know are going to happen with Joy, giving her more emotional attachment to the whole situation, which is something that we didn't really get in the games. Again, kudos. Moving on. Next scene after Rio's victory, we see him crossing paths with the scout, and the scout says, meet me at Dragon Street after dark. Now this in itself, slightly different from the games because in the games you had to win a lot more fights, not just one, to get the attention of the scout. So in this, he's like, meet me at Dragon Street after dark, after that one match. Again, cut to the point, which I don't mind. Moving on. Next, we see Joy back in Aberdeen on her bike, and then Wong catches up to her, and he's like, hey, have you heard from Rio or Ren? Like, what's going on? Aren't you worried? And she's like, they shouldn't get caught up with the Chiyo men and the Yellowheads because that's too much to handle. She just doesn't want to be a part of it. And then she has a flashback of what happened to her dead mom when she got blown up. Again, it's adding more backstory that we didn't have previously. I'm gonna grab my coffee. Moving on, we cut back to the scout talking to Rio. Now the scout sees Rio and he's like, let's go down this way. Now in the games, when they go down, they speak in a like dark but scenic area, but in the animation, they just look like they're in an alleyway. Then the scout tells him, here, beat this guy up and then we can proceed. And it's only one guy. And that's different from the games because the games, you have to fight 3 fighters in order to proceed. But this is just one fight. And the scout is like, just go down that way. Where in the game, you have to look for these guys in pretty scenic, nice areas. I like the fighting arenas in the games. Whereas in the animation, it's just kind of like, beat up this guy, he's right over there. I get why they did that, but I really miss the impressive fighting arenas from the video games. Now, in the fighting arena, we see, first thing, Master Baihu beating up somebody. Now, Master Baihu, you don't see that early in the games. You don't see him until basically you're going to fight him. But in this, he just beats up the guy, looks at Rio, and is like, huh, and just walks away, like no emotion. Now then Rio gets presented with Greg Moore, and Greg Moore is the second of 3, technically if you go in order, with fighting the 3 opponents. And basically Rio's up to fight Greg Moore, and holy moly, he beats him in like 2 hits. Elbow assault, 1 punch to the face, and he's out. I had to watch that scene like 3 times because I was like, holy moly. He's so strong, so powerful, which was pretty cool. So what happens immediately after this fight? The scout is like, okay, go here, meet me here. And he's like, okay, that's it. Like after that one fight, it's like, okay, he proved himself. When the games, you have to beat 3 of them. And in the games, you have to go back to Dragon Street where then he gives you that additional information. Whereas here, it's all just happening in like one same similar location. In the games, after your fight with Greg Moore, you get into a kind of like a conversation with Ren, where Ren's mad at you because he lost the bet, because technically he bet against Rio. In the animation, this conversation happened after his little conversation with the scout, but it's the same thing. He's like, darn, I lost because of you. Now, the difference here is that now, because of the way the animation presented that initial discussion where Ren was like separate from Rio because Rio told him to stay away, it almost gives a reason as to why Ren is mad and he's like betting against Rio because he's like, screw this guy. So I thought that was pretty cool. And then the final tidbit that was added to the animation that wasn't in the video games is that we see one of the members of Yellowhead actually keeping an eye out on Ren and Rio, which was part of the plot that Yuan and Dan Yu are arranging. Again, added story. Next, we see Yuan telling Dan Yu that they've made contact with Lan Di and Lan Di's going to pick him up tomorrow. So Dan Yu's super excited that finally he's going to get to conquer the underworld of Hong Kong. So, quick scene, not in the games, pretty relevant. Another scene that's completely original is now we're back at Bailu Village in Shenmue's house, and she sees that her dad's not home yet. And she's like, Oto-san. That's the Japanese version of dad. She says it so much in the games. Anyway, she sees that he's not there, and she's like, he must still be in the quarry. But then she sees a printout of basically the Dragon and Phoenix mirror. That diagram is actually in the games as well, but this scene isn't. But she recognizes it in this animation, which is pretty interesting. And it cuts to the next scene. Next original scene is that we have Joy overlooking her mom's grave and basically saying that she never forgave her father or the syndicate, I guess over the events of what happened. Again, it's adding more emotion to Joy's character, which is pretty cool. I'd rather these moments than all of the filler that we would have had if they would have included like a bunch of stuff from the games. Now moving on, we see Wong bumping into Sam, Larry, and Cool Z, and they're basically telling Wong, hey, let's trick another person, let's trick more people. So Wong's like, fine. He goes into the mall, and then he actually sees in the far distance one of the Yellowheads talking to one of the Chiyu men, and this Yellowhead member was telling him, look, you've got Yanduzu, but Yanduzu has allies. But don't worry, we're keeping track of the Japanese guy and this other guy, Ren of Heavens. When Wong hears that, he's like, Ren of Heavens? Yellowhead turns around, he's like, oh crap, he heard everything. So he starts chasing Wong, and as Wong's being chased, he runs by Larry, Sam, and Cool Z, and they're like, what's going on? And he just hightails it out of there because he's getting chased. I figured, why wouldn't these guys, Sam, Larry, and Cool Z, at least help Wong? They just are like, what? What the heck's going on? I don't know. So now this next scene takes place in the games and in the animation, but slight differences. In the animation, Ryo goes meet with the scout, and then as the scout's there, Ren just comes out of nowhere and punches him, doesn't knock him out, but gets more information, like where are they holding Yanduzu? And then the scout eventually admits he's on the 17th floor, and then Ren knocks him out. In the games, same thing happens, except Ren just knocks this guy out with one blow, and that's it. He doesn't give up any additional information. But what happens is, after they knock the guy out, they try to go through this door that's locked. Wong just happened to be following them and unlocks it for them, and then says, hey, I heard that Yanduzu's on the 17th floor. Go there. That's the difference. They just took out Wong from the scene. And I guess it wasn't really necessary to have Wong there, a part of that scene. And then what happens in the animation too is that Ren gets the radio and is like, hey, saw these guys on the 5th floor, go there. Again, to distract the rest of everyone who's doing security. Now, something similar happens in the game, but that's much later when they're climbing the floors. Ren has the radio. Again, just repositioning things, making them relevant, but proceeding on quickly for the story. And then the guys just catch the elevator. All right, next scenes play out pretty quickly. We see Wong catch up with Joy, and Wong's like, help, I need your help. And he jumps on Joy's bike. From there, it cuts right back to Ren and Ryo getting on the elevator. Then back, once again, to Joy and Wong, and then he basically says, look, Ryo and Ren are being tracked by the Yellowheads. They know everything. And that's when you see Joy with a worried face like, uh-oh, I gotta do something. She doesn't say it, but you almost feel that that's what she's thinking with that one close-up shot. And then finally, here we have Ryo and Ren made it to the 17th floor. They go in a room. They don't see anybody there. And then when they get out, they see Dan Yu, and he's like, I got you now. Basically, Dan Yu set them up. Now, in the games, there are certain sections or certain floors where Dan Yu does find them and chase them, but you never got any context as to how he knew they were there and that they were coming up. So this animation added, okay, he knew the whole time because they were being tracked. So it just kind of puts everything together quite nicely for you. So now you know why Dan Yu knew where they were and was chasing them out. But in the animation, they added drama to actually running into Dan Yu, and we'll see what's going to happen next. So in this first series of shots, it's almost like a previously in Shenmue, which shows Wong catching up to Joy on her bike, and then it shows Ryo and Ren going up to the 12th floor and then not finding anything, and then of course getting caught by Dan Yu, and then right there the intro starts. Now none of these scenes are really in the video game, so it's just a previously on Shenmue, and I covered what happened in these scenes in the previous episode 11 comparison, so check that out if you want to see the details in that. Moving on. Now in this next scene, it's continuing on the conversation between Joy and Wong. Now Joy is like, what are you doing and why are these guys after you? And Wong's like, we gotta help Ryo and Ren because they're in trouble and we gotta do something about it. And Joy's like, I told you, this is not going to work. They're too powerful, we can't mess with them. Wong gets off the bike and he's like, you know what? My entire life I've been struggling, basically just stealing, and just because I would steal one day didn't guarantee me that I'd have what I need for the next day. And this is how I lived my life, and I'm tired of living that way. And when I met Ryo, Ryo taught me that you can live with a purpose, and I feel that if I help Ryo, I will be able to have that purpose and change my life. And that's what Wong wanted to do. And Joy kind of felt bad, you could see that in her eyes, but Wong was just like determined, so he was off. Now this is completely original to the games, but it's adding some context to story that we didn't really see in the video games and we needed more information on. Moving on. Now we're back at the Yellowhead building where Dan Yu found Ren and Ryo. They decide to run because they're like, we can't deal with this guy right now. So when they run, they cross this plank that basically leads them to the other side of the building. And Dan Yu is chasing them. Ren goes first, and then Ryo goes. And right before Dan Yu is able to catch up to them and follow them, Ren kicks over the board and he's like, stupid Dan Yu, and he can't chase them. Now this scene in particular is in the video games, but slightly different. When Ryo's climbing floors in the Yellowhead building with Ren, they come across this plank and Ren goes first, just like the animation, and then when Ryo's about to go, out of nowhere, that's when Dan Yu's like, I got you, and then he starts to chase them. So as Ryo, you gotta make sure you don't fall off the plank. And then, just like the animation, Ren kicks over the board and Dan Yu can't chase them. So you could see the similarities there, but the animation had it connected a little bit more to why you were getting chased by Dan Yu at that point. Moving on. So in this scene, Joy's having flashbacks with Ryo on her mind because she's outside the come over guest house. That's where she used to meet up with Ryo, and then she just starts to feel bad. From there, that's when members of the Yellowhead find her and she skids away. Now with all this guilt that she's feeling, she finds Wong and then she picks him up. And then Wong's like, hey, did you change your mind? And she's like, no, I didn't change my mind. It's because of you that they're chasing me now. So then she decides to take him to the Yellowhead building, but then she's like, we gotta come up with a plan. So you're gonna be my little brother. He's like, what? She's like, trust me. And a funny thing that happens is one of the members of the Yellowhead steal a bicycle just to be able to chase them, which I thought was hilarious. Again, none of this is in the video games, but it's adding context that we needed to the games. Moving on. So Ren and Ryo escape from Dan Yu, but as they're climbing up the stairs, they run into Yuan with a chainsaw. Yuan then radios in and he mentions that he found these rats and he starts to chase them with the chainsaw. Now Ren and Ryo hightail it out of there, and then a couple of Yellowhead members get in their way. They kick them over and they keep running. Now right before they're able to get away, Ryo kicks over a support beam that drops in front of Yuan, knocking him out, blocking his way to pursue them, and of course Yuan's trapped and can't chase them. These scenes play out almost exactly the way that it plays out in the animation. In the video games, Yuan finds them, Yuan calls it in the radio, then Yuan chases them. The difference though here is that in the game, you actually fight a few more Yellowhead members and go through a few obstacles before you're able to completely get away from Yuan by kicking the support beam. So that still happens. Ryo kicks the support beam in both cases, and it's pretty close to the games, which is cool. Next up. Now this next scene is pretty quick. It shows Joy and Wong arriving at the Yellowhead building, and as they run in, they want to try to get in, but how are they going to get in? Well, Joy admits that she's Chun's daughter from the White Tie, something that Wong had no idea was actually true. So when that happens, the Yellowhead members are shocked that Chun's daughter is right there at their door. Now, previously in another episode, it was speculated that Chun's daughter could have been Shu Ying, but it wasn't. The series did actually hint to the fact that Choi was Chun's daughter, and this actually confirms that fact. So it's not Shu Ying, it's Joy, and it makes perfect sense. And that whole scene was completely original. Moving on. Now this next quick scene shows Yuan actually being found by Dan Yu, and Yuan's grateful for being saved. And then Yuan gets a radio call that's saying, oh, we're in trouble, we got a situation. So Yuan's like, what's going on? And none of that is in the games as well. Again, it's just building story, building a lot of original content, which is exciting to see. Moving on. Jumping into this next original scene, again, not in the games, you see Joy and Wong sitting in a room because they were taken up there by the Yellowhead members. And Wong's pretty much wondering, how were you connected to Chun? And he re-explains the story of the White Tie and what happened. And then Joy says, I don't need a history lesson, you just need to figure out a way to snoop around. But he's like, what if I get caught? And she's like, well, there's more than one way to snoop around. And they look at the vent, because the vent is the way to snoop around. Completely original to this series, but it's useful. Moving on. Next up, Dan Yu and Yuan get a radio call that they've got Chun's daughter. And then when Dan Yu hears this, he's like, okay. And Yuan freaks out because Yuan is thinking they're here to sabotage our deal with Lan Di. But Dan Yu's like, you know what? If that's the case, lock her in the basement. So that means basically Joy's gonna get locked in the basement. We move on to see Ryo and Ren just kind of running around, and then they hear the radio call that they're going to lock up Chun's daughter in the basement. At this point, Ryo's like, what's going on? And Ren's like, I know Chun's daughter, and she's here. It's Joy. And that makes them both determined to go to the basement and rescue Joy, which is pretty cool. Slightly different from the game, but I'll get into how it's different a bit later. So in this scene, it shows Joy by herself because Wong actually escaped through the vents, and the Yellowhead members walk in because they're going to listen to Dan Yu and take her to the basement. They're asking, where did your little brother go? And she's like, I don't know. He wanted to take a piss or something. Then they tried to grab her because she was trying to get smart with them, and she obviously is easily able to defend herself. At that point, Master Baihu walks in and he's like, let him go. And she's like, what if I don't feel like it? Master Baihu quickly runs in and knocks Joy out with one blow. And then they proceed to take her to the basement. Now, this scene doesn't take place in the video games, but none of what the reason was for Joy to get captured was in the actual video games. She was just captured. So all of this can be considered canon, in my opinion, when it comes to Joy getting captured, Master Baihu having her in the basement. Pretty cool. But, like I said, not in the video games, but it gives context. Now, quickly moving on, we see Ren and Ryo make haste to the basement because they want to find Joy. Meanwhile, you have Wong going through the vents looking for, clues or whereabouts of their friends, when he happens to fall through a vent where he finds Yuandazu. Now, he doesn't realize it's Yuandazu at first until Yuandazu tells him, I'm Yuandazu. But then they hear rustling outside because Yuan is about to actually walk in the room to see what's going on after she hears a noise. Wong is able to successfully hide in the vents again, so Yuan doesn't find him and the Yellowhead members don't see Wong at all. And they're basically going to take Yuandazu out at this moment and bring him to Landi for the meeting. However, when Wong realizes this, he wants to save Yuandazu. So when he sees the rats in the vents, he lights a match that makes all the rats land on top of Yuan, freaking him out, and he runs out of the room in a panic. At that point, Wong takes the opportunity to grab Yuandazu and roll him out of the room. Now, none of this also happens in the games, but it's adding stuff that we never saw before to the lore of Shenmue, which is pretty cool. Now, this next scene is pretty exciting. Ryo and Ren finally make it to the basement where the Yellowhead members are holding Joy captive. Now, right as they're about to all get into a fight, Master Baihu walks in and he's like, no, if you can defeat me, I'll let you have the girl. And at that point, Ryo steps up and he's like, let's go, basically. He's ready to go. And they start to fight. And now in this fight, Ryo starts having flashbacks of all of the 4 voodoo. All of that's in his mind because all of this is coming together at this moment. And this is a moment that matters. He's got to save his friend Joy. Now he punches Master Baihu first, which Master Baihu blocks. They go for a couple of moves back and forth, but none of them really hit each other until Ryo lands a kick that knocks Master Baihu out. At that point, Master Baihu's defeated and he can take Joy. But then Master Baihu gets up a little bit and he's like, what's your name? And he's like, Ryo Hazuki. And then he's like, I won't forget that name. At that point, they get to have Joy. Now, the games is slightly different because to get to Master Baihu, Ryo actually goes down by himself because Ren parted ways with Ryo earlier on when he was actually taking care of a few Yellowhead members while Ryo searched for keys to go down to the basement. Ryo's purpose of going down to the basement was to make it up to the 40th floor, and the elevators in the Yellowhead building only let you go to certain floors. So the only one that let you go up to the 40th floor was an elevator from the basement. So when he goes down to the basement to get to that elevator, he sees Joy captured by Master Baihu and he's like, you can have her if you can beat me. Same situation, and they fight in a cage rather than just in the basement, which was pretty cool. I like that cage fight in the games. But the scene then plays out similarly where when Ryo wins, Master Baihu's like, what's your name? Ryo Hazuki, I shall remember that name. So that's pretty cool. But difference here also is that we had no context in the video games as to why Joy was captured or why she was there. It was just, she was there, you gotta save her out of nowhere. And Ren was not there, like I said, because he was helping distract some Yellowhead members so that Rio can go to the basement. Moving on. So in this next completely original scene, we see that Yellowhead member on the bicycle make it to the Yellowhead building, and then the other guys actually arrived in a car, and he's like, what the, you guys had a car? Then he goes up and makes it up to Yuan, and he's like, Yuan, what happened? And Yuan's like, oh, I got all these rats, and he's like, well, where's Zhu? Where's Yuan de Zhu? So he runs in to see where Yuan de Zhu is at, and Yuan de Zhu is gone. None of that happens in the game. Moving on. So Rio and Ren then wake up Joy, and they ask her, why are you here? And she was like, why am I here? To save you guys. And she's like, where's Wang? And then they overhear on the radio that Wang is escaped with Yuan de Zhu, and they're like, oh my goodness. Now the games is slightly different when it comes to this scene because Rio wakes up Joy by himself, Ren is not there, and they don't talk about why she's there until they get into the elevator to go up to the 40th floor. Rio asks Joy, why are you here? And again, she was like, why am I here? I was here to save you. But we never got any context as to why she was there to save him or what happened to her that got her captured. And then she tells you immediately that Wang was taken up to the 40th floor. It's just them two in the elevator going up to the 40th floor. So she knew where Wang was and that Wang was captured at this point. But in the animation, she had no idea where Wang was. So that's pretty different. And of course, Ren wasn't there. Moving on, we see Wang running with Yuan de Zhu, and this never happened in the video game, so we didn't see that they were actually together. And then there's one Yellowhead member that has been chasing Wang this whole time, finally see him there, and Yuan de Zhu's like, run faster, I got this. Yuan de Zhu knocks him out, and they keep running towards an elevator, which looks like they're finally gonna escape, but then out of the elevator, Dan Yu makes an appearance, and he's got them. None of this was in the video game, but then it added context as to how Wang got captured by Dan Yu, which was pretty important to the series. Now, in the video games, none of this context happened, but somehow Joy knew that Wang was captured. Some of this might not be canon or can't be considered canon because how would Joy know that Wang was captured and taken up to the 40th floor? Who knows? A little bit of a mystery. Moving on. So now this next scene has a few differences between the games and the animation. Rio, Joy, and Ren are running back upstairs to find Wang and wherever they might be. And when they're doing that, they run into Yuan once again. Yuan's sporting a knife and starts to attack Rio and Ren. Now they handle Yuan quickly and kick him into the elevator. Now in this first step, there's a couple of differences. Rio is with Ren in this scene when it's happening, and instead of sporting a knife, Yuan still has the chainsaw that he was chasing them with. Now they kick him into the elevator and then they want to start to interrogate him. Now in the animation, Joy, Rio, and Ren start to interrogate him and he's very resistant to any interrogation until Ren comes and brings the trash can. And then pretty quickly he confesses that, you know what, they're taken up to the roof. Now the difference here is Joy is not in this scene, it's just Ren and Rio. And when Ren brings out the trash can, rather than say that they're on the roof, Yuan says that they're on the 40th floor, and to get to the 40th floor, you need a key that's on the 18th floor to be able to activate the elevator to go up to the 40th floor. So it's a little bit more intricate in the video game because they want to, of course, prolong your trip to the roof. So like we've seen from most of the animation, they just take you directly to the spots you need to go rather than making you do all these side missions. Makes a lot of sense. And then, of course, in both the animation and the video game, Ren kicks the trash into Yuan, and then Yuan's all disgusted, and the elevator goes down. Pretty cool that it happens in both. Moving on. Now, in this final scene, we see Rio, Ren, and Joy run up to the roof, and right there, Rio makes it out to the roof, and then he sees Lan Di up in the helicopter, and he's like, Lan Di! Such an epic moment. And that's where the animation ends. Now that's pretty quick when compared to the video games, because in the video games, Rio's with Joy, and they both are in what seems to be like the main base of operations for Dan Yu. When they go into a room which looks like it's Dan Yu's office, Rio confronts a bunch of members of the Chiyu men, beats them up, goes out a side window by himself to beat up a few more and then make it to the roof. When he makes it to the roof, of course, because the game had to prolong some of the gameplay, we see Rio look at, on a helicopter, Lan-Di. And it's from there on, it's pretty similar. He's like, Lan-Di. So they both end, at least at that point, pretty similarly, with those slight differences in the video game. The episode opens up right away, similar to the previous ending where Rio is looking at Lan-Di in the helicopter. I talked about this in my previous breakdown. Added to this scene shows Rio having flashbacks of his father's murder. Then Joy and Ren catch up with Rio. They see Yandezu capture, and they also see Wong hanging over the side of the building, being held by Dan Yu. Very similar in the games, but here's where changes start. Lan-Di actually touches ground. Rio then charges at Lan-Di, and Lan-Di realizes that he's the Hazuki boy after blocking Rio's punch, then makes quick work of Rio. Dan Yu is wondering why no one is paying attention to him holding Wong hostage, but Lan-Di puts one hand up, which shuts up Dan Yu. Rio tries again and gets his punch easily swiped away. Lan-Di even compliments Rio and tells him he's improved. Lan-Di then finishes off Rio with a chest strike. Yandezu wants the fight to stop and for Wong to be put down. Lan-Di agrees and Wong is tossed by Dan Yu. Yandezu then tells Lan-Di that the other mirror may be in Bailu village. Dan Yu then freaks out and worries about his plans for taking over Hong Kong, but the Chiyu Men guard tells him that now it's his opportunity to prove that he can do something useful for Lan-Di. So Dan Yu sets his sights on Rio and his allies. Dan Yu is about to hit Rio since Rio doesn't take his sights off of Lan-Di, but then Ren tries to save him, but they end up both being knocked by Dan Yu. When they regain their footing, Rio is still after Lan-Di until Ren tells him to snap out of it and not to be blind to what's in front of him, which triggers a flashback for Rio of Xiuying telling him the same thing. He also reminds him of not stopping until he reaches his goal, which caused another flashback. At that point, Rio realizes that he's got to do something, as Wong, Yandezu, and Joy watched from a distance. Rio instructs them to run, but the Chiyu Men try to stand in their way. Ren says he'll handle him, leaving Rio to face Dan Yu on his own. Rio strikes first to little effect on Dan Yu before Dan Yu slams Rio to the ground and steps on him. Joy, Wong, and Yandezu look on, worried. At this point, Rio starts having flashbacks of moments that reflect somewhat of father-son relationship moments, reflecting on his readiness and the reason why he practices martial arts. The Xiuying flashbacks in particular is emphasized, where she stated, "Like the stillness of the surface of water, you must clear your mind. Become free from distraction and channel your focus entirely on your mind itself." At that point, Rio shuts his eyes after getting up, which distracts Dan Yu. He then blocks a swing from Dan Yu, flips over him, and kicks him in the face. It cuts back to Ren, who finished off the Chiyu Men, then back to Dan Yu as he charges at Rio. Rio is focusing on his mind, and then blocks Dan Yu's strikes and throws him off completely. This is where Rio finally does the counter elbow assault to finish off Dan Yu. As the gang celebrates, Joy feels a special kind of peace, since the man who murdered her mother is finally put down. Rio then watches Lan-Di fly away in the helicopter. Pretty exciting. Now let's talk about how the game played this scene, a little different. Let's start where Rio is looking at Lan-Di on the roof. At this point, the helicopter rope ladder gets closer to a completely knocked out Yandezu. Dan Yu then tells them to freeze as he holds Wong. Now in the game, there was no explanation of how he got his hands on Wong, so the animation added context where the game lacked it. At this point, Dan Yu brags that he has earned the right to serve Lan-Di. Lan-Di does not come down from the helicopter at all, nor does he advance any closer. He just watches. Then unlike the animation where Lan-Di told him to drop the kid to get information from Yandezu, Wong simply just bites Dan Yu and then gets thrown, and Rio actually catches him. The Chiyu Men then try to put Yandezu on the rope ladder to the helicopter, but Ren and Joy quickly stop them. Dan Yu, angry that all of this is happening, faces Rio and challenges him. Lan-Di then just begins to ascend, as there seems to be too much trouble at the moment. Rio and Dan Yu both notice that he's out of there. This angers Dan Yu even further and makes him want to smash them into pieces. Ren says he'll deal with the rest, leaving Rio to deal with Dan Yu in a final fight. Standard affair here until after dodging 3 attacks, Rio thinks of Xiuying, who says, "Concentrate on yourself and stay calm like a polished mirror." He then says to himself, "Concentrate only on your mind." Then, just before Ryo performs counter elbow assault, he has very quick flashbacks of his friends before pulling it off. With Danyu defeated, Ryo once again looks at Lan Di. Lan Di looks at Ryo, then looks up so they can fly off. He never says a word. After he flies off, Ryo is frustrated again, and Yanduzu, who is now awake, says he's gone. Ren then puts his hand on a frustrated Ryo's shoulder and says, "I'm not giving up." So in this first scene, there's a lot more context to the story in the animation, whereas the game had a few plot holes and unanswered questions that the animation took care of. I like that. Pretty good scene. In this next scene, we're back at Ren's hideout, where Yanduzu is speaking with everyone. Yanduzu tells Ryo that Lan Di sought retribution for the death of his own father, Sun Ming Zhao, and mentioned that Lan Di's real name is Long Sun Zhao, and that he firmly believed that Yuao had murdered his father. Then they begin to talk about the mirror. Yanduzu recognizes it and immediately says that it used to belong to Sun Ming Zhao. He reveals that they are a key to the treasures that are intended to revive the Qing dynasty. This makes Ren happy. Yanduzu reveals that you need both mirrors to actually reveal what the secret is. Everyone grows frustrated with not knowing the truth about what's really going on. Then Yanduzu suggests that they should go to Guilin. This is where Sun Ming Zhao and Iwao train together, and the home of Phantom River Stone, which was used to carve the mirrors. He then lets them know that Lan Di is going there too, which gets Ryo excited. Yanduzu told Lan Di to go to Bailu village in Guilin. Ren also noticed Ryo stopped touching his bandage when mentioning Lan Di. From there, Yanduzu insists to Ryo that he should keep pursuing the truth. Now the games are mostly the same, but there are a few key differences in this scene. First, when hearing that Iwao might have murdered Long Sun Zhao, Ryo stood and insisted that his father would never kill. The animation didn't show that type of reaction from Ryo. Also in the game, Yanduzu mentions that he knows Iwao brought the mirrors to Japan. In the animation, he only mentioned that he knew the mirrors belonged to Sun Ming Zhao. In the game, Yanduzu also mentions that Sun Ming Zhao was his best friend, and if he lived, he would have become a legendary martial arts master. One of the biggest differences between the games and the animation is this part right here. Yanduzu insists that the lights be turned off. He then lights his pipe and blows smoke over the mirror, which unveils light patterns above the mirror, indicating the location of the treasure. He clarifies that a single mirror is not enough, and you need the dragon mirror as well to reveal the full location. From there, he says to go to Guilin, because that's where Zhao and Iwao trained when they were younger. This is slightly different because it had no connection to the earlier scene on the roof. Moving on, this next scene shows some original footage before his trip to Guilin. Wang and Joy catch up to Ryo in Aberdeen to say goodbye. In the games, however, when Joy and Wang say goodbye, they're still in Kowloon. Wang also gives Ryo the double-sided coins that Ren used to win bets against Ryo, which never appeared in the anime. Also, towards the end of the scene, we get this nice cool knife throwing scene from Ren. The animation then shows Ryo going to say goodbye to Fang Mei, which does not happen at this point of the story in the game. Also, Han Hui Lu asks if he has learned all of the master's teachings. Ryo says not yet, and that's why he's going to Guilin. Fang Mei then insists that she knows that the reason that Huan Hui Lu persisted on helping Ryo was because he had Master Shu Ying on his mind the whole time. All of this is original. From here, Ryo is able to say goodbye to Shu Ying. Now this next scene plays out a little bit differently in this when compared to the games. Starting with the animation, when Ryo goes to speak with Shu Ying, he speaks with her in the temple. In the games, they speak outside of the temple at night after a really cool sequence of moves from Shu Ying, where she performs the move Demon's Triangle, and Ryo's handed a move scroll by Han Hui Lu. Back to the animation, Shu Ying asks Ryo if he's going after Lan Di, but he insists he's going after the truth. Then she hands him her half of the yin-yang symbol, which was given to her by her brother. She tells him she doesn't want him to end up like her brother. The same happens in the game as well, though the flashback in the game is a bit more drawn out. In the conversation, Ryo also insisted on the fact that he understands how her brother felt, and that he's certain that Shu Ying's brother is alive somewhere. This shocks Shu Ying. Ryo then says thanks. In the games, Ryo does say that he understands how her brother felt, and also insists that her brother is alive as well. So, similar. The main difference in the conversation is that Ryo doesn't exactly state that he's going after the truth, not Lan Di. Moving on, the next shot here is reminiscent of goodbyes from the game when you were originally leaving Wanchai to go to Kowloon, though the animation had a few more completely original scenes to show. One showing Joy at her mom's gravesite, noticing that her dad must have left her flowers, and that she should pay him a visit sometimes. Then it shows Sam, Larry, and Coolsey shocked, and then showing Ren that Wong is doing the legitimate business from now on, selling bananas. These scenes add some nice closure to characters that we didn't get in the games at all. It shows Ren walking away like he's got something on his mind. Guilin. This moment must have been used to replace the knife throwing scene, which was cooler in the game, but seemed to have more meaning here. Transitioning to Guilin, we see the boat arriving to Guilin just like the games, though the animation gives a shot of Ryo looking at the picture of Sun Ming and Iwao. The series then immediately cuts to rainfall. This was quick. The series completely skipped Ryo arriving in Guilin, then asking for directions to Bailu Village before being told that it's a walk that will approximately take 3 days. When Ryo starts on his journey, it starts to rain, which is where we catch up to on the animation. But the animation did show a flashback saying he needs to pass through the mountains to get there, which at least added some context. Cutting straight to action, a fawn is drowning in the river due to the storm, just like the games. Shenhua dives in immediately, causing Ryo to panic and dive in too to help. The difference that I find here that may be a translation issue is that in the animation, Ryo says, "Let the goat go, you'll drown." In the games, Ryo insists that Shenhua let the fawn go. If you don't know, the name Bailu from the village comes from the translation of white deer, which is the reason she was saving the animal. So not sure if it was a mistranslation or this was on purpose in the animation to call it a goat. Ryo then saves them and passes out. In the game, Ryo saves them and they pass out as well. You see, there was discussion in the game on how white deer basically saved Bailu Village, and it's actually a treasured animal. The animation makes no reference to that story. Moving on. Next scene opens up with Ryo dreaming about his dad and how he always told Ryo he was lacking. After meeting so many people, he's realizing that maybe what he's been searching for is what he's lacking, and that he's going to keep moving forward. All of a sudden, he wakes up in Shenhua's house. What? How in the world did Shenhua drag him through that entire 3-day trek by herself? In the games, which is way different, Ryo and Shenhua walk through the entire journey, talk a lot, bond, dodge obstacles, sleep in a cave, climb and survive mountains before they finally make it to her house. Back to the animation. Shenhua thanks Ryo for saving the baby goat, which again doesn't seem right. After the introductions, Shenhua tells Ryo that they're in Bailu Village, which makes Ryo run out the door. He then sees an image of his father standing next to a tree. When Ryo asks about the tree, Shenhua says it's the SHENMUE tree. She says the flowers bloom at this time every year, and that it's a family tree. She then reminisced on how she grew up with the tree, and the flowers that bloom on the tree are called Shenhua, just like her. So in the games, this scene takes place when they arrive at Shenhua's home after the long walk. In the flashback, you get a bit more dialogue with the parents revealing Shenhua's namesake with dialogue from her parents, rather than Shenhua telling Ryo directly. Ryo then expresses that it reminds him of the cherry blossom tree back home, and that it's special to him too. This wasn't really discussed in the animation. Moving on, back inside, Ryo asks Shenhua if she lives alone, and then she states she lives with her father. Speaking of that, in the games, Shenhua mentioned that her father isn't her biological father, and that he's just a stepdad, since she lost both of her parents. In the animation, she just mentions that her mother is gone. At that moment, Ryo notices the diagram of the mirrors on a table in the middle of the room. Shenhua shares that her father told her it's just been passed down by many generations. Ryo puts his mirror on the diagram and it fits perfectly. Shenhua asks where he got that mirror, and she states that it's made of Phantom River stone. She then starts to explain of a legend in her village. Long ago, special mirrors were made from Phantom River stone at the direct order of the Emperor, but there were disputes over the ownership due to the hidden powers they contained. Most lost their lives. She then insists her father may be able to tell him more, which prompts Ryo to ask for her to introduce him to her father. Now the game plays these scenes a little differently. Ryo doesn't immediately stumble upon the diagram in the table. Instead, he finds it in a room after SHENMUE invites Ryo to look around. She says that it's been in the family since long ago, and that Phantom River Stone is only found in Bailu Village. She then states her father might know something, which prompts Ryo to ask her about her father. That's it. No legend expressed in the game. Much of the legend context could actually be uncovered in SHENMUE 3, not SHENMUE 2. The last difference is that in the animation, they go to the stone pit right away, while you have to wait until the next morning to go to the stone pit in SHENMUE 2. And finally, the animation pretty much just zooms right to the cave and immediately shows SHENMUE and Ryo noticing the door is ajar from where her father works. She doesn't know what's inside, since she has never been permitted to go in. So something's wrong. They both proceed and immediately they find the letter from her father, along with the sword just laying there. She begins reading the letter, and the credits start to play. While reading the letter, they continue to explore the cave and the scene. The letter also explains the relevance of the Sword of 7 Stars, and that she should keep it by her side. Ryo places his mirror on a groove in a shrine, which starts the fire on the lamps and ropes in the room. This eventually revealed the 2 giant mirror replicas. Quick flashback to Ryo's dad, then the poem is recited by SHENMUE, though in the animation it's not said out loud. It seems that she was just thinking it to herself. Flashbacks of Ryo's adventure play out. Then they're staring at each other from outside the cave. From there, the story goes on. Done. Now, let's get to the differences in the game. In the game, Ryo doesn't head off to the cave until the next morning with SHENMUE, after she's finished making lunch. Ryo then starts walking with her. They start to talk again before they get to the cave. SHENMUE then notices that there are no birds right before they get into the cave. This makes her realize something's wrong, so they rush inside. Once in the cave, they arrive where SHENMUE normally leaves her father food. She calls for him, but hears no answer. After further exploring, she expresses that there's a door that he may be behind. When they get there, it's similar to the animation. Once inside, it reveals the same type of cavern as the animation, though you can see much more of what it looks like in the game. They find the path, and there, further down, they find the letter and the Sword of 7 Stars. At this point, they have to find the proof in the cave, which they start to look for. First, they find a small shrine with what looks like it should be a sword placed in it. When attempting to put in the sword, Ryo struggles, but when SHENMUE takes over, she's able to do it without even touching it. This then causes a second shrine to rise. The indentation on the second shrine required the Phoenix Mirror, which Ryo places in it. From there, the Sword of 7 Stars begins to float. Light from the Phoenix Mirror flashes, then shoots a ray to the sword. From the sword, the ray shoots back to light a fire, which in turn connects to the ropes and the other light sources in the room, revealing the giant mirrors. From here, SHENMUE actually recites the poem while Ryo listens. Ryo asks about the poem, and SHENMUE expresses that it has been told in the village from long ago. And from here, they look at each other, and it makes me feel that they both just realized, oh crap, this was destined to happen. Then you see the closing picture of the game, and the story goes on. Key specific differences there. It seemed to be a lot more stretched out in that final scene, with a few more details. That's the full compilation. You made it through the entire video. Thank you. I hope you subscribed if you enjoy my content, and look out for more SHENMUE and other video game related content right here on my channel. Take care.